Buenos días, bienvenidos entonces a este segundo día del segundo simposio Cochrane Colombia, Avances en Síntesis de Evidencia para la Toma de Decisiones. Quiero saludar a todos nuestros asistentes presenciales y telepresenciales. Tenemos en este momento más de 300 personas conectadas. Somos aproximadamente 1000 asistentes a este simposio. Gracias por aceptar la invitación. Tenemos entonces como objetivo principal conocer los avances recientes en diferentes temáticas en el campo de síntesis de evidencia que han surgido como respuesta a las necesidades actuales. Además, diseminar experiencias de incorporación de síntesis de evidencia para la toma de decisiones en salud. Vamos entonces a iniciar este bloque de conferencias en la mañana y quiero dar la bienvenida con síntesis de evidencia para la toma de decisiones COVID por John Lewis. Él es fundador y director del McMaster Health Forum, es codirector de la Comisión Global sobre Evidencia para abordar los desafíos sociales, la red de evidencia COVID-ENDS, es codirector del Centro Colaborador de la Organización Mundial de la Salud para Políticas Informadas por Evidencia y profesor en el Departamento de Evidencia e Impacto en Salud en la Universidad McMaster, así como profesor adjunto en el Centro Africano para la Evidencia en la Universidad de Johannesburgo. Le damos entonces la bienvenida a John Lewis. Doctor, good morning. You can now, you conference, please.
Thank you very much for having me. I think we're starting a little bit late, so I'll cut maybe about 5 minutes off my talk to get us back on time. Iban thought it might be helpful to talk about COVID and some of the lessons learned from it, but I'm also going to talk about its legacy in the form of the Evidence Commission, which released its report back in January and just became available in Spanish, thanks to the work of the team here at the University of Antioquia. So if I tell this story about COVID, if we look back to now 2 years and 2 months ago, the early days of the pandemic, there were so many unanswered questions and people were incredibly interested in pulling the evidence together. In the early days, we were having to pull evidence together from previous pandemics or related issues, but over time, more and more COVID evidence came available. So there was an explosion of interest in and demand for synthesis, but there was also an incredible increase in supply. All of a sudden, researchers around the globe were trapped at home. They wanted to help. They started to move into the synthesis field, many of whom were not trained in evidence synthesis. And what we found when we looked at all that early wave of evidence synthesis, very uneven coverage, huge amounts of synthesis on public health measures and clinical management, very few on health system arrangements and economic and social responses, and a horrifying amount of duplication of effort. And there was also tremendously variable quality. So 1 in every 4 syntheses was of low quality, not really worth looking at all. And about 1/2 were only of medium quality. And you'd still be feeling a bit awkward about sharing that evidence with decision makers. And because so many of the syntheses were rapid syntheses and not updated, they became out of date very quickly. And it took a long time until living evidence syntheses started to take off. So we had this tremendous problem with a very, very low signal to noise ratio. And it was very hard for decision makers, despite their interests, to find and use the best available evidence. So COVID came together in April of 2020, a time-limited network. We brought together 55 of the leading groups around the world, evidence synthesis groups, technology assessment groups, and guideline groups, to try to improve coordination and reduce duplication. And you'll see here on the slide the timeline. Just in under 2 weeks, we went from the email to people saying, hey, do you think there's value in us coming together, to forming the network, agreeing to the name, and establishing 7 working groups that would advance the work. These are some of the partners that are involved. You'll see in the top right corner, Agree. So that's Iban and his team. You'll see many Cochrane entities, but Iban was wearing his Agree hat the day we put the logos on. So you don't see Cochrane Colombia, but they have been very involved. Some of the early wins in the sprint phase, we developed very early on a guide to key COVID-19 evidence sources because a lot of people didn't know where to go to find good sources of evidence about COVID-19. That was later superseded by the inventory, which I'll talk about shortly. Second, resources to support researchers considering or conducting an evidence synthesis. So again, with all the new entrants to the field, many people didn't know how to conduct a high quality evidence synthesis. David Tovey, who had been the editor of Cochrane for a decade, was instrumental in working with teams around the globe to develop those supports. Iban and his team then developed something similar for guideline developers. Again, a lot of people moving into the COVID guideline space, and Iban and his colleagues were able to develop resources to help them. We also developed principles and resources to support evidence packaging for decision makers. So not only were many of the researchers that moved into the space new to synthesis, they also were new to communicating to decision makers. And it's a very different skill set that needs to be learned over time. We also supported the COVID-19 community, so people around the globe who were doing work like us, working directly with decision makers. We had a listserv, we brought them together in webinars frequently. Colleagues at the University of Johannesburg maintained a living hub of COVID-19 knowledge hubs, so you could find other groups if you wanted to know who in Ghana was doing COVID-19 data analytics work, or who in Argentina was doing evidence synthesis work related to COVID-19, you could use the Knowledge Hub to find them. And then we, along with Cochrane and the World Health Organization, acted as the secretariat for the ECC19 network, which brought together even more players globally. In the marathon phase that we're in now, over 2 years of doing this work, our most important global product is the COVID-19 inventory of evidence syntheses. So we do all the work for decision makers of finding the evidence syntheses, rating them for quality, extracting the date of last search, looking to see if they have a great evidence profile, and using those 3 criteria for any given COVID decision, we will say here is the best evidence syntheses, or here are a small number of the best evidence syntheses. We no longer look at all of the reviews dealing with single drug treatments and so on, because we now have living evidence syntheses that speak across all drug treatments. So I'm sure the number of evidence syntheses about COVID-19 is now in the many tens of thousands, but we have processed more than 13,000 of them to be candidates for best. And we currently have, or we did as of a few weeks ago, have 652 that were deemed best based on those criteria: recent search date, high quality review using AmStar, and availability of a great evidence profile. So that's a huge improvement in the signal to noise ratio, and it makes the life of decision makers much, much easier. In Canada, we built out a partnership with Cochrane Canada and with the SPORE Evidence Alliance, and shortly you'll hear from Andrea Trico, who leads the SPORE Evidence Alliance. And we do 2 things. We work with governments across Canada to better coordinate demand. So we have an intake process, so all of our governments across the country can feed questions into us. And then we farm out the opportunity to more than 40 teams across the country who can respond. So whoever's the best person, if it's about myocarditis as a risk that may come with vaccination, it goes to the group that has done previous work in that area. We also have a pool of 20 citizen partners, and we can call them up and say, we need this work done in 5 days. Can you join the team and bring a citizen perspective to this work? And these amazing citizen partners do that. We also continue to do a monthly horizon scanning exercise to identify emerging issues where we can get ahead of decision makers, anticipate what their evidence needs are, and initiate the process of doing the evidence synthesis. The other thing we do is we actually produce syntheses through this network of 40+ teams, 2 different types that I'm going to talk about on the next slide. One, ultra rapid, contextualized rapid syntheses, and the other, living evidence syntheses, which we think of as global public goods, which, while they may be produced in Canada, can be used by any group around the world. And by month 17 of funding, we produced 150 evidence products specifically around COVID-19 decision making. So the ultra rapid contextualized evidence syntheses, the most common ones that our shop does, we call rapid evidence profiles. So they're not syntheses per se. They don't come to a bottom line statement. What they do is map in a complex area all of the existing evidence syntheses and on highly focused issues, highly relevant single studies. And we also do a jurisdictional scan because often decision makers are dealing with issues that are just emerging. Omicron comes along, changes the game in a variety of ways, and they need to figure out what to do. They want to often learn from countries that are a few weeks ahead of us. So it might be Israel one time, South Africa another time. So we do jurisdictional scans to find what their early responses are and whether anything has been learned from them. And we also look at what's happening in every Canadian province and territory. So decision makers find this hugely helpful because they get an overview of what is the exact state of synthesized evidence, what are some key studies they need to look at, where are the leading edge countries in terms of their response, and what's happening currently across the country. We also now have a product line that is a living version of these, which we update every 2 to 4 weeks. So in the early days of vaccine rollout, we maintained a living evidence profile on what do we know about effective vaccine rollout, everything from upstream procurement down to working with racialized communities to try to improve their vaccine confidence and uptake. We also maintained one on dealing with the crisis that we were experiencing in long-term care homes, where huge numbers of Canadians were dying of COVID under very, very difficult conditions. So those are the ultra rapid contextualized evidence syntheses, best evidence from around the globe, a sense of what people are doing from around the globe, but written in a language that resonates with Canadian decision makers in this case. So using frameworks they're used to, language they're used to, and talking about what does this evidence mean for us in our country at this time. But the other thing that COVIDN does is support living evidence syntheses, which we consider, again, global public goods that any group in the world can use. 3 of them currently deal with vaccine effectiveness. So the first one focuses on real-world vaccine effectiveness. So not the trials, the real-world observational studies. And this first one on adults, we've been running for over a year now. It was originally updated every week because there was so much urgency in knowing about the evolving pattern of effectiveness. A new one then started on children and adolescents, led by people here at the University of Antioquia, Iban, Danielle, many other people who are here in the room, Pamela. And then there's a third one on waning immunity. So these are updated now either every 2 weeks in the case of adult and kids, or every 4 weeks in the case of waning immunity, used by people in many, many different countries, but also by Canadian decision makers. And there are other examples. We also support a living evidence synthesis about care models for post-COVID conditions. I was saying yesterday to Iban and Danielle, it kind of feels like Colombia and Canada are the only countries in the world where there's active collaboration among groups producing these 2 very different types of syntheses. So I know great groups in the world doing Cochrane reviews, evidence-related global public goods. I know great people around the world doing highly demand-driven, contextualized evidence support. I know very few groups who actually collaborate. And the amazing thing about the team here is they're bringing those 2 very different worlds together. So I'll just transition to COVIDN's biggest legacy, which is the Evidence Commission report. So I finished my PhD at Harvard 25 years ago, and it felt like in the last 2 years, we learned more about how to support decision-making with best evidence than we had in the previous 23 years. And we also found the greatest demand that we'd ever seen. Prime ministers and presidents and ministers and heads of large organizations, everyone's saying we need the best evidence on topics. So it feels like a really critical juncture in our lives as people trying to support the use of evidence in decision-making to learn the right lessons from the last couple of years and figure out how we build a better system going forward to support decision-making. So the Evidence Commission report brought 25 commissioners from around the globe across the full spectrum of societal challenges, all types of decision makers, cabinet ministers, organizational leaders, professional leaders, citizen partners, and I think I said all major world regions. So you can find the reports available in Spanish, thanks to our colleagues here at the University of Antioquia, both the executive summary and the full report. Some of the messages in the report. One is about the burning platform. We can't allow the low signal to noise ratio that we saw with COVID-19 to be our future. It's just a horrifying amount of research waste. So this slide shows you the uneven coverage, very few syntheses on economic and social, huge number on clinical management. It shows you the variable quality, light blue, 1 in 4 low quality syntheses, gold or yellow, 1/2 only medium quality. So we could have saved a lot of this research waste had we had a suite of living evidence synthesis on the big topics that every country in the world was grappling with. The second part of the burning platform is we cannot continue to respond to policymakers' questions with preprints that haven't been assessed for quality and put alongside all the other studies addressing the same question. Squeaky wheel experts who aren't transparent about the evidence that they are drawing on when they're making claims. Old school expert panels. So some of the people in this room do leading edge work on guideline panels. Most COVID-19 panels, including almost all of them with one exception in Canada, were old school, what my former department chair, Dave Sackett, used to call GobSat panels. Good old boys sitting around the table. No pre-circulated evidence, no focus on grading recommendations, and we shouldn't be in that space today. So on the left side, you'll see some of the things that unfortunately got relied on more than best evidence, chasing after preprints, experts with their own personal views, expert panels that didn't follow best processes. On the right, you'll see some forms of evidence got better traction. So while COVID-N is a nice story of how evidence syntheses emerged as very important, when I look back at Canada and many other countries where we have collaborators, the types of evidence or the forms of evidence that got most attention in COVID-19 were data analytics, modeling, and one-off evaluation studies. And best-in-class evidence syntheses, best-in-class guidelines often didn't get the attention that they deserved. So some of the other insights from the Evidence Commission report, every country needs an evidence support system alongside these other things. So Colombia, like Canada, has for many, many years had a research system. You're all part of that research system. You also have an innovation system with patents, all kinds of stuff with licensing. But what we don't do is formalize the evidence support system. The types of things that we saw put in place for COVID-19, grounded in a particular context, could be the country of Colombia or the Department of Antioquia. It's demand-driven, and it's focused on contextualizing the evidence for a given decision in an equity-sensitive way. Some of the examples of what this means in practice: evidence support units that can combine the power of national evidence, so those data analytics, the modeling, the evaluation, the behavioral and implementation research, the qualitative insights that tell us what has been learned in our country or our department, with the power of global evidence. And that's where the evidence syntheses come in. And we need both. We can't just have the local evidence. We can't just have the global evidence. We need to be able to combine them. We also need expert panels that follow rigorous processes to develop evidence-based recommendations. It happens in the clinical world. Why can't it happen in the public policy world? We need government science advisors who speak in a way that makes it possible to judge their accuracy. We should be able to say to them, tell me how you identified, appraised, and synthesized the evidence that you're drawing on when you say we should do this. And finally, we need processes to elicit and prioritize evidence needs, know what decision makers' questions are, find and package evidence that meets those needs and set time constraints, strengthen capacity for evidence use. So policymakers need staff who know how to find this kind of evidence and to work with people like Danielle and others. And we need to incorporate evidence use into routine processes. So one thing we're currently doing in Canada is writing to every part of the government of Canada, our Cabinet Office, our Ministry of Finance, our Treasury Board, our Science and Technology Ministry, and say, we've just analyzed what you do. We think you're doing this part well, but we really think you have to up your game in these domains that the COVID situation has laid bare as where you really should be upping your game. So just to make that one point that I made on the previous slide again, because it's so important, we have to combine local evidence with global evidence. And you'll see in the first row of this table, those 5 forms of local evidence that are typically encountered by decision makers. The second row is where the evidence syntheses fit in. And then at the bottom, we have recommendations, which typically come in the form of technology assessments or guidelines. On the right-hand side, you'll see living syntheses. The big aha for most people in the evidence world during COVID-19 was living evidence syntheses. They have completely changed how policymakers think of the value of evidence. And the bad thing for the evidence community is, from policymakers' perspective, the new normal is living evidence syntheses. You cannot go back to one-off reviews. We have to have a system where on the big priority challenges of the day, we have living evidence syntheses that slot the new evidence in based on its quality. So we have a continually evolving picture of what we know. In Colombia, the issue may come up next Wednesday. In Canada, it may come up a month from Friday. And decision makers in both places should be able to go to a living evidence synthesis to understand what do we know at this moment in time. The other point about evidence support systems is they need to use the right strategies to support the use of best evidence for the right issues and context. So this is where, relying on the research system, we will continue to fail. We have to formalize and strengthen this evidence support system. If we want to improve the climate for evidence use in countries like Canada, the most important thing we need to do is have very difficult conversations with our government science advisors. Most countries are like Canada. Our government science advisors know how to do research. They do not know how to support decision-making in hours and days like policymakers need. If we want to do more in the prioritization and production side, we have to do more of that co-production work. We have to have policymakers on our teams. We have to have citizens on our teams, keeping us focused on what matters. So when we produce the best evidence, it's informed by the context in which that evidence will land. Then we need that timely, demand-driven, contextualized, evidence-focused type of evidence product, the type that Danielle and colleagues here at Antioquia do, the type that we do at the McMaster Health Forum. We need one-stop shops, so decision makers can, in minutes, reach into the evidence world and pull out what they need. I gave you the example of the COVID end inventory. We also maintain databases for how do you strengthen health systems, get the right program, services, and products to people. That's health systems evidence. To the credit of our public health agency in Canada, they just sent a new request to us. They want us to maintain a living map of all living evidence products in all of public health. And it's a great question. They should know at any moment on an array of issues, what are the best living evidence syntheses out there in all of public health? Because they may need to quickly produce a brief on climate action. They may need to quickly deal with some other issue, and they need to know where those living evidence products are. And the final piece is that opportunity to talk with citizens, talk with stakeholders, informed by best evidence about how we need to do things better or differently in future. And now we're starting to bring that living approach from evidence products to processes like citizen panels and stakeholder dialogues. So the Evidence Commission's current implementation priorities, one is strengthening national evidence support systems through rapid learning and improvement. I mentioned Canada. We're on a full court press right now with our Canadian federal government to say you're doing this well, but you really need to up your game in these areas. We're working with someone who many of you know, Marcela Viernes, who is doing a similar analysis for Colombia, and then we'll be working with Danielle and others to talk about how do we reach out to decision makers in Colombia. In a few weeks, you're going to have a new president. There's going to be a lot of change happening one way or the other at the national level. Now is the time to be there talking about where best evidence is. If the outcome goes one way, the demand for evidence may go up. I'm not sure what's going to happen if the election goes the other way, but we'll check in with you in a few weeks. Implementation priority number 2, enhance and leverage the global evidence architecture. So the global evidence architecture largely failed us in COVID-19. The amount of research waste was absolutely mind-boggling. And we need the producers of evidence-related global public goods, critically Cochrane, to improve their prioritization process, increase their coordination, maintain an evolving suite of living evidence syntheses, partner with groups like Danielle and others who provide timely demand-driven evidence support. So you produce the best-in-class global public good, but you need to have partners who can contextualize it for their country. And we need to start foregrounding equity and context considerations. A global public good is great, but when Ethiopians look at it, they need to know, do the findings vary by groups and contexts, because their take on it may be very different from ours as Canadians. So some conclusions, 3 of them. First, from my perspective, we're facing a once-in-a-generation opportunity to work with political leaders to build on the right lessons learned from our own and other countries. So why do I say now? 25 years, to me, this is the best chance we have ever had to up our game in using evidence in decision making. First reason, we have a cadre of leaders who have personal experience with what worked well and could have worked better. So we need to act while they're still in place. Second, we've had unparalleled innovations in evidence products and processes like living evidence syntheses. We need to make this the new normal. Third, COVID-19 evidence investments are coming to an end. They could just disappear or they could be reinvested in the future. Fourth, we have lessons learned about needing to have evidence supports in place that can pivot to address health emergencies. The next global crisis may not be a pandemic, but our evidence systems need to be working well so they can pivot to whatever it is. And finally, we're increasingly aware of now all of the health challenges beyond COVID-19 where we need similar efforts for best evidence. Second conclusion, we need to strengthen national evidence support systems through rapid learning and improvement. And I've talked about that already. And thirdly, and finally, for those of you who are Cochrane folks, we need a reinvigorated Cochrane to be at the center of an enhanced global evidence architecture that makes sure the right living evidence syntheses are there when we need them. So tremendously daunting task for Cochrane, but also a tremendously exciting task. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting academic space. Continuamos entonces con revisiones sistemáticas de pronósticos por Farid Forután. Él es de la Red de Salud Universitaria de Toronto, Canadá. Es profesor asistente en métodos de investigación en salud, evidencia e impacto de la Universidad McMaster Hamilton de Canadá. Le damos entonces la bienvenida. Farid.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk about systematic reviews of prognostic factors. This is an area of expertise for me. In my studies. I've become more and more involved with prognosis, and about 90% of my time is now dedicated to issues related to prognosis. So I'm happy to be here and talk about this. When Yvonne invited me, I thought it would be a good idea for us to review the different types of research questions that we can ask for systematic reviews of prognosis, and then compare how these reviews, and we can talk about how these systematic reviews differ from the traditional ones that we see in the world of therapy for the different stages of their conduct, how we differ in terms of how we do our meta-analyses, and issues around subgroup analyses. And then finally, at the end, if time allows, hopefully we can talk about one of the latest developments in grade, which is around calibration of these prediction models that we do systematic reviews on. So it's important to get our heads straight with regards to the different types of questions that we can ask. And the three questions can be divided into categories of overall prognosis, prognostic factors, and accuracy of prediction models. With overall prognosis, we're generally asking a question around a group of individuals being followed for a duration of time into the future, and what proportion of these individuals experience a patient-important outcome that matters to decision makers and health policy individuals. For prognostic factors, now we're getting a little bit more specific. We're getting a little bit more granular. We're not now asking about everybody in this room and their prognosis for a particular outcome, but rather we're now trying to differentiate based on specific characteristics that categorize us into one group as opposed to another, and we try to get more specific prognosis. And then finally, with prediction models, this is now where we have multiple characteristics coming together in the form of a prediction model, and anybody can either go into a calculator or use an equation, put in the information about the patient in front of them, and get an accurate estimate of what their risk of a future patient-important outcome could be. And so we have examples of these. So in overall prognosis, you could, for example, care about the risk of a valve failure in individuals who have their aortic valve replaced. And that's just an overall risk. For prognostic factors, you might be interested in knowing what is the risk in older individuals as compared to younger individuals for maybe losing their kidney after a kidney transplant. And then for the accuracy of prediction models, an example of it is, for example, the RECODE score that takes in patient characteristics and tries to tell you what is the risk of all-cause mortality in patients who are living with type 2 diabetes. There is different importance to these questions that we ask. Traditionally, with overall prognosis, where it helps decision makers is that it informs the baseline risk to which we apply the relative effects of interventions. So this is an example from a guideline on whether patients should be receiving transcatheter versus surgical aortic valve replacements. And the relative effects of the interventions, it came from a systematic review of therapy question, comparing the two different forms of intervention. But as you know, whenever we do randomized controlled trials, we typically exclude patients who have the most important prognostic factors because we think that they're going to be at increased harms. So it's not the most optimal form of a baseline risk. And sometimes guideline panels, what they do is that they commission a systematic review of overall prognosis, and the estimates from the overall prognosis serve as the baseline risk to which we apply the relative effects of the intervention. The other benefit of overall prognosis is that typically with randomized controlled trials, you follow patients for a short period of time, might be 2 years, might be 5 years at best, but overall prognosis evidence takes you to the long term, and it's very helpful to know what's the long-term projection of these outcomes in the patients who we're trying to make sure guidelines and recommendations on. For prognostic factors, their importance can be in two areas. One is future planning of studies. So in randomized controlled trials, if you find a prognostic factor that's super important and critical, then we can use it for stratification or adjustment in future RCTs and developing even future risk prediction models. If we find that there's a prognostic factor that's super important and hasn't been considered in the prediction models that currently exist. And in terms of clinical decision making, these factors can also be super helpful. Sometimes we don't have trustworthy prediction models. We might be in an area where it's super new to consider prediction models, and maybe there's no model at existence, but you still want to get more granular estimates to have that shared decision making process with your patients. Prognostic factors can help, and it's more granular information as opposed to the overall prognosis estimate that you can use in your shared decision making. With regards to risk prediction model, in one disease area, we may have many different prediction models that are developed. I'm sure many of you know that there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that's just about development of these models. People develop, and very few of them make it to external validation. But in instances where you have multiple models and you're stuck to know which one do I use, which one's more accurate, where you can you can do a systematic review of prediction models, identify every single prediction model in your disease area of interest, and then based on the relative performance that you've summarized from the meta-analysis, you can inform a panel of experts who are trying to make recommendations around prediction models that this might be the most optimal model to use in clinical practice. So how do these reviews differ from the traditional systematic reviews that we see in the world of therapy? And they differ in almost all aspects of the conduct of a systematic review, with the exception of how we screen for evidence, because I think that's pretty standard. You try to minimize human error, you try to do it in duplicates, independent reviewers. That is very standard bread and butter of systematic reviews. Our research questions differ. In prognosis, we don't have interventions and comparators. In overall prognosis, we don't have any of it, but in prognostic factors, we have those who've been exposed to the prognostic factor and those who haven't been exposed to the prognostic factor. The way that we do our search strategies differs because we implement search strategy key terms that are very specific to issues of prognosis. And I'll show you examples of that. And how we extract information, the information that we extract from these studies is quite different than how we do it in the world of intervention. And also finally, the way that we analyze our data. So I'll hopefully show you some examples from all of these different aspects of doing the systematic review. First, to begin with the search strategy, we have specific key terms that you can use to identify evidence related to prognosis. And these can be combined in different ways to either maximize sensitivity, so find anything that's remotely resembling an issue of prognosis, or maximize specificity, which I generally don't think it's a good idea because it's too specific and you might miss things that are also related to prognosis, but not quite there. And then there's a balance between sensitivity and specificity. And so these are from our University of McMaster University. It's publicly available at the highroot.mcmaster.ca website. And there are mesh terms or subject headings that you can search in bibliographic databases like Medline and Embase that will try to get you all the studies that by design are related to issues of prognosis. With regards to data extraction, it differs even with the type of question that we ask in prognosis. For overall prognosis, again, like I said, we don't have any intervention, we don't have exposure or a comparator. Most of the information that we're extracting from these studies is about the baseline demographics of the patients. Who were these patients that were included in these cohorts? What sort of therapies were they on? But it's all about average statistics that were included, and we try to see how generalizable or applicable they are to the patient population that we're seeing in our clinical practice. For prognostic factors, here we do have exposure or no exposure. Whether who were the men, who were the women, how many of them were there, what was the prevalence of the prognostic factors? If the prognostic factor is, for example, diabetes, what proportion of patients had diabetes, what proportion of patients had hypertension. We try to extract information about the two different groups that compose those with the prognostic factor and those who don't have the prognostic factor. We want details around the definition of these prognostic factors. So if people are saying diabetes, it's not good enough to just say diabetes. We have type 1 diabetes, we have type 2 diabetes. How was it diagnosed? These details are very critical when we're trying to communicate the results of prognostic factor systematic reviews to our audience, and as they're trying to use this evidence in their clinical practice. And as I said, prevalence of a prognostic factor is super critical, because you can imagine that I can talk about a prognostic factor that has a huge impact on patient-important outcomes. It might have a relative risk of 5-fold or 7-fold. But if the prognostic factor is only present in 1% of the population, it's a very irrelevant prognostic factor. In 1% of the population, it makes a huge deal, but in other people, it's not present. So we need to be very clear about the prevalence, and the prevalence of these prognostic factors is an element of data extraction that is often missed in individuals who are doing these systematic reviews for the first time. With regards to risk prediction models, again, a lot of the information here is around who were the patient populations that were included in the studies. And then we extract details around how did they make the model? What went into the model? What is the model trying to predict? Is it cardiovascular mortality, all-cause mortality? What is the specific definition of the outcome that they're trying to predict? What were the individual prognostic factors that went into the model that made it? So for example, if you're talking about CHADS-VASc, which is a model for predicting stroke in patients who have atrial fibrillation, what are the individual factors that make up CHADS-VASc, like previous stroke, the sex of the patient, and their age, right? So we need to be super clear so that people who are now trying to understand these models, they can also appreciate the burden of their use, because sometimes you have models that maybe take 5 or 6 factors and they're easy to use. You can put it in the calculator, but then you have more and more complex models nowadays with machine learning that are using super advanced data like ECG waveforms, audio from maybe listening to the heart and recording those audio recordings and using this information to develop prediction models. With regards to the results, for overall prognosis, when we're extracting the information from these studies, we typically capture how many patients were included in the studies and analyzed. We look at the number of events that they observed in their studies, again, for the whole entire cohort. And it's also very important for us to have a sense of time. When did these outcomes occur? What was the median time to these outcomes occurring? Because that helps us with determining incidence rates. And more new method that we're trying to implement more and more in reviews of overall prognosis is to actually extract specific probabilities at every single time point that's been presented in survival curves, Kaplan-Meier curves. This is very granular information, and recently, I think it was in 2016, Patricia Guyett, she developed an algorithm within R that when you give this algorithm the specific probabilities at each time, the number of events and the number of people who are at risk, this algorithm can simulate the individual patient data that created the published Kaplan-Meier curve that you've identified. This is a very powerful tool because we have a hard time trying to ask for individual patient data from the authors. This algorithm can simulate it very accurately. And now we have these multiple different databases which we can stack together and possibly do individual patient data meta-analyses. For prognostic factors, obviously, as I mentioned, we want to extract information about the outcomes and the definition of the outcomes that were associated with the prognostic factors. We extract information about whether it's the odds ratios, risk ratios, hazard ratios that tell us what was the association between the prognostic factor and these outcomes. And we also want to have a sense of the 95% confidence interval or the error within the studies around these measures of association. These information is essential for us to now start to do one meta-analysis per prognostic factor per outcome. The other key thing with the prognostic factors is that we need to know what other prognostic factors were adjusted for in the multivariable model. If you're operating in a world where you need to use multiple prognostic factors to inform your estimate of prognosis about the patient who's in front of you, univariate associations is not going to be good enough. They're always going to be overestimating the risk in your patient. That's why we typically look at multivariable estimates. But when you're looking at multivariable estimates, these estimates can be quite different depending on what other factors have been adjusted for. A study that adjusts for 10 different factors like age, sex, hypertension, comorbidities like diabetes may be completely different than one that adjusts only for age. So this can be a huge source of heterogeneity that we observe in the evidence on prognostic factors, and it will be extremely helpful to have information extracted so that we can possibly propose subgroup hypotheses to explore that potential source of heterogeneity. With prediction models, we typically look at the performance of these models, and the most commonly reported estimates are either the concordance statistics, C statistics, or the area under the curve. And for binary outcomes, these are interchangeable and they can be pooled together. We also want to get a sense of the 95% confidence intervals and standard error, or at worst, the p-value of these estimates. And in cases where the authors are only just reporting the C statistics or the area under the curve and they don't tell you the measure of error, there are formulas that have been developed by Cochrane Prognosis Methods Group that allows you to use information from the study to estimate what the 95% confidence interval would have been. With calibration, this is where we have the biggest challenge. First, many studies don't even address the topic of calibration, and in some cases where they do, It may be a curve, a calibration curve, which we can narratively try to summarize and describe to our audience. Sometimes we also have the observed to expected ratio, which is a very unideal measure because it's about the total observed event rates in one cohort and the average expected probability that was predicted by the model. And we compare these two numbers in the form of a ratio. But you can imagine that if in my cohort, the model overestimates in half the population and underestimates in the other half, on average, I'm going to have a observed to expected ratio of 1, which says that what I observed in total agreed with what the model said. But in reality, that model was completely miscalibrated. So it's not a very ideal measure, and I'll be talking about it a little bit more towards the end. With regards to our meta-analyses, this is for overall prognosis. We typically work with proportions. So we have the number of events on the numerator, and we have either the median follow-up multiplied by the sample size to give us a person's year denominator so that we can have a sense of an incidence rate. Then we tend to do these meta-analyses of proportions, and there are specific packages that allow you to do this, like Metaprop, either in R or in Stata. And the reason that you need to do this is because the way that we deal with standard errors in proportions is completely different than how we deal with standard errors in issues of therapy. You cannot have a negative probability. So there is a lower limit to where your 95% confidence interval can go. And these specific packages have algorithms that can deal with this, and they're the most ideal to use. However, there is a problem with proportions. They're not ideal statistics. If you think about stroke, the risk of stroke is the highest after you have a surgery, a cardiovascular surgery. So if you're using the median follow-up of the study to try to calculate an incidence rate for stroke, that incidence rate could be underestimating for the risk of stroke immediately after the surgery, and it could be overestimating the risk of stroke in the long-term follow-up. So it's not a very ideal measure because it assumes a very linear relationship for prognosis. A more ideal way, as I was mentioning, is this algorithm by Patricia Guyot, where in this case, we had 93 studies, and each individual line that you're seeing, it looks like somebody with a messy hair that didn't comb their hair. Each individual line represents one single study that was included in the systematic review. And each of these lines was our recreation of the published Kaplan-Meier curves. So we used the algorithm, we obtained 93 data sets that then we stacked together, and then we were able to pool, quote unquote pool, it's not an actual meta-analysis technique, to obtain these overall survival curves that then be stratified based on the subgroup hypothesis on age of the patients. I say quote unquote pool because Kaplan-Meier estimator doesn't have a way of capturing the clustering of patients from different cohorts, which is one of the fundamental principles behind meta-analyses. It assumes that everybody's coming from the same cohort. They're not all coming from the same cohort. There's specific unmeasurable differences between these that we need to capture. And one of the reasons that you see that we don't have a 95% confidence interval around these estimates, because they're extremely narrow, artificially narrow. Again, because it doesn't capture the between study variability that exists between these cohorts that we've extracted from the Guyot algorithm. For prognostic factors, again, meta-analysis math is on the linear scale. The measures of risk ratios, hazard ratios, odds ratios, they're on the exponential scale. So we need to take their natural logarithm to bring them onto the linear scale so that we can do linear algebra along with the respective standard error. Then that's when we do the pooling of the ln of the odds ratios or the ln of the risk ratios. Odds ratios and risk ratios are very time specific, so we need to be clear at what time point we're doing the meta-analysis. So it could be maybe mortality at 1 year, and then we combine these. Hazard ratios, as long as the proportional hazard assumption has been met, they can be considered along with risk ratios and odds ratios for specific time points. But we now have equations that we can use to convert between hazard ratios and odds ratios to bring everything onto the same scale for meta-analysis. But as I mentioned, we do one single meta-analysis for each prognostic factor. You wouldn't combine age with sex with diabetes because they're completely different prognostic factors. So one specific prognostic factor gets its own meta-analysis for each specific outcome that's being included in the review. And you have an example of this on the right-hand side. So this is a meta-analysis looking at the relationship between recipient age and the risk of losing the graft at 1 year. And so these are the individual studies. And what we typically do in systematic reviews of prognostic factors, and this is my recommendation, is to not limit yourself to one specific prognostic factor. When you're doing a systematic review of prognostic factors, try to do it on every single prognostic factor that's been reported in the studies. And if there is a prognostic factor that's been reported on by more than one study, then that's amenable to doing a meta-analysis. So the output of these reviews would look something like this on the right bottom side, where you have a summary forest plot where each line is one individual prognostic factor that was amenable to meta-analysis, each line being its own meta-analysis. For prediction model, we do one meta-analysis for each prediction model, for each specific outcome that's being predicted. And so the other thing is we tease out calibration and discrimination. If you can you do a meta-analysis of discrimination separately, and then you do a meta-analysis of calibration separately. For binary outcomes, area under the curve and C statistics can be pulled together because they're very, very similar in nature. And again, one of the biggest challenges that we have is around the calibration of these models. First off, not a lot of studies report on it. And then when they do report on it, we don't have a way of pooling calibration curves at the moment. That is why many systematic reviews of prediction models, what they end up working with is the observed to expected ratio. And again, this is not a very ideal measure. So on the right-hand side, you have some examples. This is the CRB65 model. It's a model to predict pneumonia in the general population. And the top panel is the meta-analysis of discrimination. So the C statistics or area under the curve. And at the bottom, you have the observed to expected ratio for representing its calibration. One of the biggest insights that we've had on these reviews is that this meta-analysis, the pooled estimate, is extremely unhelpful, extremely unhelpful. As you can imagine, on half of these studies, we're suggesting that the model is underestimating, and on the other half, we're suggesting that it's overestimating. On average, we're saying that, oh, the model calibration is perfect. Observed to expected ratio of 1. That's terrible. We're giving the wrong message. So we need to move beyond the pooled estimate and consider the totality of the studies that are being presented on the forest plot and our visual inspection of the forest plot to make inferences about the calibration of these prediction models. So I'll end here for the subgroup analyses. With regards to subgroup analyses, this is another big insight that we've had. Subgroup by nature is a third variable that modifies the relationship between one variable and your independent variable and your dependent variable. In overall prognosis, we don't have an independent variable and a dependent variable. So how could there be a subgroup? If you find a factor that modifies overall prognosis, by definition, that's a prognostic factor. So whenever we're doing these systematic reviews and we're doing these quote unquote subgroup analysis, in actuality, we're exploring prognostic factor, but in the form of between study prognostic factor assessment. And for prognostic factors, that's actually where we do have subgroup analyses, because there you do have an independent variable and a dependent variable and some third variable modifying the relationship between your independent and your dependent variable. But with risk prediction models, it's very similar to overall prognosis. It seems that there is no relationship to be modified. So therefore, the term subgroup is not an ideal description of what we're doing here. We're exploring factors that may modify how well the performance of the model is being depicted in different cohorts. So for risk of bias, this is one thing that's critical, and I wanted to give you some updates here. Some of you may know that QUIPS, Quality and Prognostic Studies, has been a tool that's been around for prognostic systematic reviews and evaluating the risk of bias in the individual studies. And many folks in the field of prognosis, we use this tool, whether we're talking about overall prognosis or prognostic factor. QUIPS is designed for prognostic factors. So by the time that we get to overall prognosis, we're modifying the tool, which is not a very ideal situation because it's not standardized practice in terms of the tool that you're using for assessing risk of bias. PROBAST is a newer tool, which is for prediction model risk of bias assessment. Both of these tools are, by the way, from Cochrane Prognosis Methods Group. And I just wanted to let you know that in the horizon coming up, we're having an update to QUIPS. So QUIPS 2.0 is coming out, which is now only going to be for prognostic factor studies. We're now having ROBUPS, risk of bias and overall prognosis studies, which is now a tool that's specific to overall prognosis. So we no longer have to take another tool and modify it for overall prognosis. And with the emergence of artificial intelligence, every journal that you open every day, you see something about machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's important for us to have a risk of bias tool that's specific to these types of studies. So PROBAST is coming out with a specific version that asks you specific signaling questions about the conduct of modeling with machine learning algorithms. I wanted to quickly go over the latest concept that we've had in grade, and this is specific to calibration of prediction models. And again, just to bring everybody onto the same page, calibration is essentially us saying, if the model says 30%, and you have 100 people who the model says 30%, how many out of the 100 experience the event? So if it's 30 out of 100, then we say that the model is calibrated because the model said 30% and the observed event rates in that group of patients was 30% as well. There is a hierarchy of how you approach calibration. We have calibration in the large, weak, moderate, and strong. These come from Van Calster and colleagues. They're part of the Cochrane Prognosis Methods Group. Calibration at large is essentially the observed to expected ratio. It's that overall measure that we have, which is not very ideal. A weak calibration is related to a calibration curve, where on the x-axis you have your predicted risk, and on the y-axis you have your observed risk. But what we do is that we force a linear line onto this curve, and we look at where the y-intercept is. If the y-intercept is at 0, 0, that means great calibration, because if the model is saying 0%, then the observed event rate was 0%. The model says 10%, the observed event rate was 10%. Assuming that the slope of the line is 1. It's not ideal because, as you can imagine, in some parts of our calibration curve, we may have underestimation, and in other parts we may have overestimation. And this linear line really just tries to generalize and misses important miscalibration in different risk groups that we have in our cohorts. A better way of looking at calibration is to actually visually inspect these calibration curves to say, okay, well, in the lower risk group, it seems like my predicted risk is 20%, but the model is the actual observed event rate was lower. So the model is overestimating, and in other parts, it's underestimating the risk. And we can have more granular description of what's happening in different risk groups. The unicorn of calibration, which we almost never see because you need databases of millions of patients, is to say, okay, with folks who have similar characteristics of prognostic factors, so folks who all had a particular age, who were all men, who all had diabetes, who all had hypertension, is the model's predicted risk agreeing with the observed event rate? But again, to do that sort of division of your database, you need massive, massive databases, and we never see this. In fact, if we see moderate calibration being reported, we're super happy. Super happy. But unfortunately, by the time that we get to systematic reviews of prediction models, all we're forced to work with is observed to expected ratio. So in the concept paper that we wrote for grade, we wanted to be super clear in how we can use this limited measure to make inferences around the performance of models. So we came with 4 considerations. The first one is that we need to be super clear about what it is that we're rating our certainty in. So for us, in the world of intervention, we talk about benefits and harms. If there's any effect of an intervention, important effect, a particular magnitude of effect. In prognostic factors, we look at contextualized or partially contextualized. And in the workshop later today, we're going to be talking about all these in more detail. And with diagnostic tests, it's about diagnostic test accuracy. But with prediction models, we think that your inference is either in a satisfactory or unsatisfactory model performance. What does that mean? With satisfactory, it could be that your observed to expected ratio is a limited measure, but we have to make do. If it's close to 1, that may imply a satisfactory model performance. We're very careful to not say calibrated because of the limitations that observed to expected ratio has as a measure. So depending on your margin of error and how much error you can accept in your clinical practice, you may come up with boundaries around that 1.0. So if you say, if I see a model that in a given study, the observed to expected ratio is between 0.9 to 1.1, then that might be satisfactory performance. You define your definitions for what's satisfactory a priori, and then you see what the evidence is showing you. And then an unsatisfactory model performance is the opposite, where the model is far away from 1.0 and it's suggesting that it's miscalibrated, even with this poor measure trying to get at calibration. The next thing that we do, which is very different to what we do with grade, is one of the domains is grade in grade is inconsistency. We're now using inconsistency to make inferences about the performance that we're observing in our meta-analyses. Normally, assessment of your heterogeneity has no bearing on the target of your certainty assessment. It has no bearing in the conclusions that we make. We always look at the pooled estimate. But now we're saying, no, ignore the pooled estimate because it's not a good measure. Look at the heterogeneity across the studies to decide what it is that you're rating your certainty in. The considerations and the tools that you can use is what we typically use for heterogeneity assessment. You can use point estimates, their overlap, and the overlap of the confidence intervals. We typically don't use I-squared statistics, because they can be overestimated in prognosis studies that have massive sample sizes. So in this case, this is the Ebel example. And you can see that, again, the pooled estimate is not ideal because there is a lot of heterogeneity, suggesting that in some studies it's overestimating and other studies it's underestimating. And so the inference that we make here, the amount of heterogeneity between these studies is suggesting that the model performance is not good. And then we go to do our grade assessment with risk of bias, indirectness, inconsistency, imprecision, and publication bias. So these are some hypothetical examples. Here, all the studies are aligned close to 1.0, so you make the inference that the model performance is satisfactory. Here, enough studies are close to 1 that you make the inference that model performance is satisfactory, even though you have some studies that are away from 1. This heterogeneity makes implications on the certainty that you make around that inference of satisfactory model performance. And again, here enough are around 1.0 that, again, your first inference is that model performance is satisfactory, but then this could create doubts because you have some studies that are far away from 1.0. Here, all the studies are away from 1.0, so it's unsatisfactory model performance. Again, many studies are away from 1.0 and only a few are close to 1.0, so your model inference is unsatisfactory performance. And here, everything is away from 1.0. So again, this is an example of unsatisfactory model calibration. The fourth is that now the degree of the inconsistency it helps us with our certainty assessment. And this is one of the domains within grade. So after we've decided on our certainty, we're now doing our traditional inconsistency assessment with the overlap of the point estimates and the confidence interval to make our certainty judgment. So in this case, we had the inference that the model performance is satisfactory and all the studies are homogeneous. So we say we have high certainty that the model calibration is satisfactory. In this case, it's a judgment call depending on your context. Some folks might say that the certainty here is high, and in other folks where their margin of error is lower, they might see the differences across the studies important to rate down for inconsistency. So our inference is that the model performance is satisfactory, but then we're rating down for inconsistency, or maybe we're not rating down. Here, more people would be saying that the inconsistency is serious enough that they're going to rate down in the inference that model performance is satisfactory. This one is a little bit unusual. It's consistently telling you that across all the different studies, the model is terrible. It's not working. So your inference is unsatisfactory model performance, but in every single study, it's unsatisfactory model performance. So you don't have doubts that this performance is unsatisfactory. And then similar here, your inference was unsatisfactory model performance, but maybe these two studies are enough to cause doubt in the inference that the model performance is unsatisfactory. So unsatisfactory performance with reduced certainty in the inference that the model performance is unsatisfactory. Here, it's consistently unsatisfactory model performance again. And this is important because the distribution of these point estimates has huge implications for what we do in the future. In the example that's on the left-hand side, we can do something about this. Maybe a recalibration of model fixes this. In this one, we also had the inference that the model performance is unsatisfactory, consistently unsatisfactory, but we can't fix this. We need to go and develop a whole new model in this case. And so what we observe about the pattern of unsatisfactory performance has implications for directions for future research. And this is an example, again, this is the EBL study. And then when we did subgroup analyses based on the overall risk of the cohorts, we saw that in the intermediate risk, it was okay. And the low risk, it was unsatisfactory. And we know exactly how we need to recalibrate to make it more satisfactory in the different risk groups. So to conclude, for this new concept in GRADE, which is now in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, we have 4 new considerations. First, we need to be super clear on what it is that we're rating our certainty in, satisfactory versus unsatisfactory performance. Unlike anything else in GRADE, the concept of inconsistency or heterogeneity informs the target of our certainty rating. Then we assess inconsistency again to see if we have doubts in the inference that we drew. And then fourth, the way the inconsistency shows itself has implications for future research in terms of whether we can fix the models or we're doomed and we need a new model. Thank you so much for your attention. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Farid, for your presentation. We wait for, para el auditorio, para las preguntas las estamos recogiendo manualmente en papelitos para que por favor las pasen para la sesión de preguntas para los 3 conferencistas, tanto para John Levis, Farid Forután y la conferencia de la doctora Andrea Trico que viene a continuación. Hi, Andrea.
Hi, Ivan. How are you?
How are you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. I'm going to make a presentation of you in Spanish, so.
Okay. Sounds great. I won't understand everything, but I'm sure it'll be perfect.
Okay, so me permito presentar a Andrea Trico. Andrea Trico es magíster en epidemiología y doctora en salud de la población. Es científica y directora del equipo de síntesis de conocimiento y de transferencia del conocimiento en el hospital Lika Shink. El instituto se llama Lika Shink en el Hospital St. Michael's en Toronto. Es profesora asociada de la Universidad de Toronto y también es codirectora y profesora asociada adjunta del Centro de Excelencia del Instituto Joanna Briggs. Bienvenida, Andrea. Welcome, Andrea, again. It's all yours. If you could share your presentation, please, to check everything goes well.
Great, thank you.
After you finish, we will have the question sessions, okay?
Perfect.
You're good.
Let me just do this. And I will do this. Okay, are we okay?
Perfect. Go ahead.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. Well, such a pleasure for me to be here chatting about a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about, scoping reviews. And very disappointed I was unable to join all of you in person. And do want to say that Yvonne is one of my favorite people and one of my favorite collaborators. So it was a real privilege and honor for me to be here speaking with all of you today. So I won't read our acknowledgement of traditional land, but just want to note that I am a white settler on this land and that I am committed to learning the mistakes of the past. So I participate in cultural safety training and working towards reconciliation with our Indigenous population in Canada. And also sit on my Research Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee at my institute. So it's a very important issue and again, something else that I'm incredibly passionate about. So in terms of some of my disclosures, I do receive a stipend as an associate editor for the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. Probably the most relevant to this talk today is that I am the chair of the JBI, which is formerly the Joanna Briggs Institute Scoping Review Methodology Group. And I do hold a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Knowledge Synthesis. And one of my goals with my Canada Research Chair is to advance the science of scoping reviews. So hopefully by the end of my talk, you'll be able to identify what a scoping review is, describe how a scoping review is useful, as well as identify methods guidance for scoping reviews and the reporting guidance for scoping reviews. So we'll start off with the scoping review definition. So before we get into what a scoping review is, I think it's important to talk about knowledge synthesis, and this is the Cochrane Columbia group, so I know everyone here will know what this is. So as a Canadian researcher, I like to use the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, or CIHR, definitions, because this is our funding agency and they really set the stage for all of us as researchers. So their definition of knowledge synthesis is the contextualization and integration of research findings of individual research studies within a larger body of knowledge on the topic. And really importantly, your synthesis needs to be reproducible and transparent, and it can also include quantitative and/or qualitative methods. So if we're thinking about the relationship between knowledge synthesis and knowledge translation, this is the knowledge to action cycle here, or the knowledge to action framework. And if we see in the middle, we have this little funnel, and we see really knowledge synthesis is at the very foundation of knowledge translation. So it really is the foundation for informed healthcare decisions, including evidence-informed medicine, health technology assessment, guideline development, policy decisions, and research funding. I know I don't have to convince any of you here. I know you all strongly believe in the importance of knowledge synthesis, but if we're thinking about knowledge translation, we only want to implement interventions that we know are to be effective, and knowledge synthesis is a great way to help us with that. So setting the stage here, there are many different types of knowledge synthesis, and today I'll be focused on scoping reviews. And to say that if you're not sure how to select a type of knowledge synthesis, we just came out with our new and improved Write Review tool. You have 41 different knowledge synthesis methods to choose from. So we've broken the tool up into quantitative methods and qualitative methods, including mixed methods. So you answer a series of very simple questions, and the tool will tell you, based on your answers, you know, it seems like a scoping review is the most appropriate knowledge synthesis method for you to use. And you'll see here that when you click on the scoping review, we will tell you the conduct guidelines for doing that scoping review, the reporting guidelines, as well as we'll give you an example or a case exemplar of a scoping review in the real world, or a published scoping review as an example. So this has been done for 41 different types of knowledge synthesis, so definitely check it out, and hopefully this will be a helpful tool for you. So in terms of scoping reviews, as I said, I've been working very closely as a chair of the JBI Scoping Review Methodology Group, and we've published a ton of papers trying to make a contribution to the field, because there is a lot of confusion between scoping reviews, systematic reviews, and other types of knowledge synthesis. So here we recently published this paper, actually just this year, providing a formal definition of scoping reviews, and this was in the JBI Evidence Synthesis Journal. And so we have defined scoping reviews as a type of evidence synthesis that systematically identifies and maps the breadth of evidence available on a particular topic, field, concept, or issue, often irrespective of source, so very broad. So we can include primary research, reviews, non-empirical evidence could be included in a scoping review within or across particular contexts. So we can do a scoping review to clarify key concepts or definitions in the literature, identify key characteristics or factors related to a concept, including those related to methodological research. So you can also do, if you're interested in doing a review of methods, a particular methods issue, a scoping review is a really helpful type of knowledge synthesis that can help you do that provide that summary of all those methods, studies, and methods that have been done in the literature. So we've done several scoping reviews of methods concepts. So what terms are used to describe scoping reviews? I always joke and say my nerdiest paper was the scoping review of 494 scoping reviews. So this is based on that scoping review. So we found different terminology that was used in the literature. Just to note as well, that the previous JBI guidance used to call it a systematic scoping review. I had to convince them to drop the systematic just because I'm hoping all knowledge synthesis methods are systematic and that we're doing them in a very systematic and thoughtful manner. So we propose that with the field, we continue using the scoping review, which was the most frequent term, and replace other terminology like scoping studies as well was used in the past, and other terms that you see here. So how do scoping reviews differ from systematic reviews? This is a chapter that I wrote with my PhD student. So shout out to Zach Bauk, who's on his way to defending, hopefully very soon, his PhD. So he wrote a really nice chapter trying to outline the difference between systematic reviews, rapid reviews, and scoping reviews, because there, like I said, there is some confusion with that. And here's a very nice table. So if you think about systematic reviews versus scoping reviews, so for both of them, we do need to use a protocol. Scoping reviews are not able to be registered with Prospero. This doesn't mean that scoping reviews are not good or important products.
You're back. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, hi, sorry. Sorry about that, everyone. I don't know what happened. I was just kicked out of there. So let me try to share my screen. Is my screen still shared?
Not yet.
Okay. So let me try this. Yes, love these technical difficulties. Okay, so let me try this again. Okay.
Now we can see the slides.
Okay, good, very good.
Yeah, you're in.
Okay, sorry, sorry, hopefully if that happens again, I'll call in with my phone. Okay, so I think that I was on this slide. I'll start the slide over again. So just to say, you know, when we're thinking in our mind, what is the difference between a scoping review and a systematic review? So both of them, we want to make sure that we use a protocol. And then the other thing is that for scoping reviews, currently they are ineligible to be registered with Prospero. And I get asked all the time, is it because, you know, scoping reviews aren't helpful or not a useful type of knowledge synthesis? And the answer to that is no, that's not the reason. The reason is that there are a lot of scoping reviews out there and that Prospero isn't able to keep up with the demand. So that was the decision that they made. Not that I agree with their decision, but I do understand, you know, that they don't have capacity to deal with all of that. So we would register our scoping reviews on other repositories. So we have Figshare and we also have Open Science Framework as examples. For scoping reviews and systematic reviews, we want to use explicit, transparent search strategies. Our data abstraction form standardized as well. Scoping reviews, risk of bias or methodological appraisal or critical appraisal, whatever you are doing, depending on which paradigm you're coming from. So if you're coming from the Cochrane perspective, it would most likely be risk of bias assessment. So that is not mandatory for scoping reviews, whereas it would be for systematic reviews. And in terms of the synthesis, I've written here no for scoping reviews because this is like a 40,000 foot view of the literature. So we're not doing a lot of really, you know, bringing things together other than some very, very broad categorization. So that's why I've put a no there. Whereas systematic reviews, as we know, we could do meta-analysis and other types of analysis and synthesis. So why would we ever want to do a scoping review? I get asked this again all the time. So they're useful for as a precursor to a systematic review. You can look to see what type of evidence is available. You could look at knowledge gaps, evidence gaps, clarify key concepts or definitions in the literature, see how the research is conducted on a topic, identify key characteristics or factors related to a concept. So these are some reasons or how scoping reviews could be useful. And why would you do one? So it helps when you're clarifying your working definitions and conceptual boundaries of a topic, examine the extent, range, and nature of available research to determine the value of undertaking a full systematic review. Also thinking about evidence that is really heterogeneous or complex, you may want to try to chart or characterize that. Again, very helpful for research gaps. You can use it to develop policy maps. It's useful because it's not limited to research studies like what our systematic reviews are. So it can be helpful if you're interested in very broad types of literature and above and beyond different studies. And really, if you get anything from my talk today, please, this is my one thing, do a scoping review if you're answering a question like what has been done before on this topic. So you can tell like it's a lot broader of a question than a systematic review, right? So a systematic review, oftentimes we're asking questions like, does this intervention work, or what is the effectiveness of this intervention? A scoping review, you would be asking a question like, what does the evidence say about this concept, or what has been done before on this concept or topic? So much broader. If you are like a 40,000 foot type of person like me, and you like something very broad, scoping reviews will be very appealing to you. That's why they're very appealing to me, because I like to be very broad and see the big picture. And then when you want to drill down into the details and get more of an answer, if something works, then you would actually move on to the systematic review. So in our scoping review of 494 scoping reviews, these were the reasons why the researchers conducted a scoping review. So it was to map and summarize evidence, inform future research, and identify knowledge gaps. So those were the most common reasons for doing their scoping reviews. And in terms of the conduct guidance for scoping reviews, so last year we updated our guidance. So we published the JBI 2020 guide to scoping reviews. So we have this in, there's a wiki that the JBI uses for all of their methods manuals. So you can definitely check that out. And then we did publish in the JBI Evidence Synthesis Journal, the updated guidance. And so we are moving beyond, the seminal paper of Arksy and O'Malley, which was published in 2005. And then we have Kuhun and colleagues who did quite a bit of advancements of the science as well. And then we're trying to again, make this a lot more tangible and hands-on so that people can really understand what a scoping review is and how you would do it. So just to walk you through quickly the steps, and I'm thinking about this as your evidence synthesis or knowledge synthesis life cycle. And this is being set up like how you would think about it with a systematic review, for example. And I'm going to show you visually where the process may differ slightly from a systematic review. So you're going to start with your protocol. Again, this is a much broader research question than a systematic review. We don't limit our question framework to PICO as an example. We use the PCC, so that's the population concept and context. That doesn't mean we don't use patients, interventions, comparators, outcomes. I've used that many times in my published scoping reviews, but in the JBI guidance, we recommend the PCC. And then again, you can register your protocol on Open Science Framework. You're going to do a similar thing that you would do with a systematic review for searching, so I won't talk about that. The same thing for study selection, and in our guide, we do recommend everything is selected by 2 people independently. So depending on what your terminology is, sometimes we call it charting the evidence, and it's just to get back that to the point with JBI, it's very broad, and sometimes the outcome results are not abstracted, which I know some people don't, that's hard for you to wrap around, because in systematic reviews, the whole point is abstracting the results. But think about it, we might be charting all those outcome measures and finding out, what outcomes have been used before and not necessarily getting to the results. And sometimes when we abstract the results from a scoping review, we get very tempted as researchers to make conclusions and recommendations about the results, and that's not what the purpose of a scoping review is. So when I'm working with my decision makers and I ask them, you know, do you need an answer to your question? And if they say yes, then I would say you probably don't want a scoping review. You probably want a systematic review. But if you want to know, you know, what programs have been done before, what interventions, you want to see the breadth of this topic for you to do some other drilling down later on, then a scoping review would be great to start off with. And then again, we don't do risk of bias appraisal. You can do this if your decision maker is asking you to do this, but because if you're really asking about a snapshot of the literature and what's been done and where the data gaps are, you probably don't need to go and do the risk of bias appraisal, and that would be focused more at the systematic review level. No meta-analysis or formal qualitative analysis is conducted. It's only simple content analysis in a scoping review. So really just like thinking of the broad categories, and it can be very helpful for categorizing outcomes, like I said, because you may see that, okay, like we just did a large scoping review of gender equity, looking at all the international literature on that, and we found that there were about 3,000 different outcomes to assess gender equity in the 560 or so studies that we included. So that's a really important finding for us because, okay, maybe we need core outcome sets when it comes to advancing gender equity within medicine and within health research. And then again, you know, we don't want to get into policy or practice recommendations. It's very, very broad, and your recommendations are going to be things like, okay, we need better outcome assessment, we need better outcome measures, that, you know, we need core outcome sets, that there are data gaps here, that these are areas for potential systematic reviews, that these programs, you know, interventions or policy programs look promising, and here they are, and here are their characteristics. That's about as much as you're going to get when it comes to making your any conclusion statements. And I do want to note that we do have a JBI scoping review methodology network. So we have about 1,000 members internationally, and would invite everyone here today to sign up if you are interested in scoping reviews, and if you are conducting scoping reviews. So, excuse me. We have a newsletter, a quarterly newsletter that highlights different methods and different exemplars of scoping reviews, and would encourage everyone to sign up to this. And then just to highlight some of our recent papers. So from the scoping review methodology group, we are trying to make a contribution, as I said, and make sure that people understand how to do scoping review and how to do it well. So if you're interested on how to write a scoping review protocol or what to include, we published a paper on that in 2020. We just recently, my colleague Hanan Khalil and myself, and she's part of the JBI Scoping Review Methodology Group as well, we just wrote a paper on scoping reviews versus evidence maps and evidence gap maps, if you're interested in those differences. And to say that the JBI has joined forces with the Campbell Evidence Gap Map Group, and so we have a task force where we're trying to sort out and tease out the difference in methods between scoping reviews and evidence gap maps and evidence maps. So stay tuned. We have a really great, another great paper that we will be submitting any day now on that topic. Really important topic, close to my heart, engaging decision makers, or we term them knowledge users in this paper, in scoping reviews. So we have provided some guidance on how to do that, and really our goal is to move towards co-creation, where we have everybody co-creating the evidence as equal members on the team. So we talk about patient engagement in here, we talk a little bit about equity as well, and the importance of that when you're engaging with different types of knowledge users on your team, and we talk about working with policy decision makers, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely read this paper. Definitely a paper that I'm proud of, and just recently published in the last month or so. We also published a paper on challenges in doing scoping reviews. So again, you know, if you're doing a scoping review and you've hit some roadblocks, check out this paper, because we provide some guidance on that as well. And to say that as if we do have any decision makers in the audience, we're also creating a risk of bias tool to assess scoping reviews, so to assess how well they have been conducted. So that is something that hopefully will come out sometime next year, so definitely stay tuned for that. And then for the reporting guidance for scoping reviews, so this is how I'm going to be ending my talk today. So we do have the Prisma scoping review checklist. So this was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. So this was published in 2018, and so it is getting a little older now. I can't believe that time has passed so fast. So just to make a plug that, you know, we did publish Prisma, the Prisma Statement 2020, which had a lot of advances in it. So I'm sure everyone here is aware of that. And so because Prisma 2020 has just come out, it means that we have to update the Prisma statement for scoping reviews. So that is something that we will be working on. And if anyone is interested in collaborating, we're actually planning to apply for a grant to update the Prisma statement for scoping reviews, for network meta-analysis, and also for rapid reviews, because these are knowledge synthesis types that are incredibly helpful for decision makers. So if anyone is interested in collaborating, send me a personal note. I always love to hear from you, and would love to include you on those initiatives. So definitely stay tuned for that. In terms of how the Prisma scoping review compared to the original Prisma items, we did exclude 5 items from the original statement. And that was because it was either focused on the analysis section, and as we said, we are not doing any analysis with scoping review other than very high level content analysis and categorizing. It really is just putting things into buckets. That's what we intend to do with scoping reviews. So these items would not be relevant. And then again, anything to do with risk of bias, because this really is your 40,000 foot view of the literature. We're not trying to drill down and tell you how much we trust the results of the literature that has been done. But that being said, you know, if your decision maker is asking you to do quality or risk of bias appraisal, you can do it, absolutely. We just try not to recommend it, because sometimes when people are asking for quality, then next thing you know, they're asking for results, and then really you should be doing a systematic review. You should not be doing a scoping review. I do want to acknowledge this amazing group of people. So the JBI Scoping Review Methodology Group, the original group, we have expanded our membership, and we do have some new members, which is really fantastic and exciting. So that the website will be updated very soon with our new members. And do want to give a huge shout out to all of our Prisma Scoping Review contributors as well. So that's all that I have for you today. Again, I love hearing from people, so send me a note anytime. And I guess, Yvonne, we have a few minutes for some questions. So I will stop sharing my slides right now.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Nice to see you virtually again.
Yeah, nice to see you. I wish I was there in person.
Hope to see you soon in Toronto. And we also hope to have you here in person.
I know.
So we're going to have a question session for you and for the other two speakers, Farida and John. But I'm going to let people know that you need to go earlier, so we will start with your questions, okay?
That's great, thank you so much. Yes, I'm chairing a call at 11. So
Okay.
My time, 11 a.m. Eastern time. So I have about 18 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So, muchas gracias a todos los que han enviado preguntas y todavía tienen tiempo para enviar preguntas. Le estaba diciendo a Andrea que ella tiene que irse un poco más temprano de acabar la sesión de preguntas, por lo tanto vamos a priorizar las preguntas que tienen que ver con la sesión que acabó de finalizar. Primero, para luego dar las preguntas, con calma nos quedamos con John y con Farid para el resto de preguntas. So, Andrea, I'm I'm going to read the most difficult question for you first, which is, what is the best translation of scoping review to Spanish? But that was a very common question from people here in the hall, but also from the people who are connected. I'm going to answer the question, of course, in Spanish. So no hay la mejor traducción, pero la que más hemos utilizado, lo que hemos trabajado un poco en el tema es revisión de alcance. Entonces van a poder leer como revisión de alcance. I will send you later the translation, Andrea, so if you are asked for one in another opportunity. So Andrea, this is also a very interesting question. Can we make decisions, sanitary decisions, healthcare decisions based on scoping reviews?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think that's a, oh, did you want to translate that in Spanish first, Yvonne?
No. Okay.
No, okay.
No, I think no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so I think that's a great question. So I think we can make some decisions based on, you know, where the data gaps are, you know, what some policy programs might be options. You know, we can get some idea on definitions and concepts for different programs and different concepts and topics. Can we decide what intervention to implement based on a scoping review? The answer would be no. So you can make decisions based on a scoping review. And I would say that, you know, you have to be very mindful of the type of decision. It really is about options and conceptual boundaries and data gaps, you know, where future research might be important to conduct. Those would be the types of decisions that you would be making based on a scoping review.
Perfect, thank you. So is a scoping review what we used to know as a state of the art of a topic, or like a state of the art review, a narrative state of the art review, or what are the difference between them?
Thank you. Yes, that's a great question. So I would say a state-of-the-art review was more like a literature review, and you didn't have all those comprehensive methods to really drill down and see, not drill down, but to really cast your net to see what studies exist or what programs exist or what different evidence exists on that topic. So to me, state-of-the-art review didn't have the same methodological rigor as scoping reviews, and that would be more like a literature review than, you know, a more refined product. So scoping reviews are useful if you have a very broad question, if you're just starting in an area, you want to know what's been done before. And maybe you want to know what other countries have been focused on, or other policies from different countries, for example. So that to me would be very different than doing a state-of-the-art review.
Perfect. Considering the difference between a scoping and systematic review, could you consider that a review of clinical practice guidelines should be considered or should be done as a scoping review or as a systematic review?
I like that question. So I've done a few reviews of clinical practice guidelines, and I like to do a systematic review approach for that, because I guess it depends on how broad you're going with a clinical practice guidelines. So a great example is when we did one on the national guidelines for low back pain, and we had this really nice matrix summary table where we had all the guidelines and then all the recommendations down the left column, and for each guideline, you know, we had a check or an X to see if those different interventions were recommended in the guidelines. And then what we did is we applied the agree to tool to those guidelines to see how well those guidelines were conducted. So if you're doing, you know, something like that on where we're looking at the diagnosis and treatment of low back pain, which is still pretty broad, I would probably choose a systematic review of clinical practice guidelines. You know, but if you were doing something maybe broader than that, then maybe you would do more of a scoping review.
If we were interested in a systematic review of descriptive studies, it would be better to do a scoping review or a systematic review?
If it's the descriptive studies, So I don't think that the study design really dictates whether you would do a scoping review or a systematic review. I think it really is the question that you're asking. So if you're asking a what works question, does this work? Then I would say do a systematic review. If you're asking what has been done before, then I would do a scoping review. So like you could still do a systematic review of descriptive studies depending on what the question would be. So I don't think it's actually the study specific study design. Let's say that you wanted to look at all studies designs on a topic area or all the evidence that's been done on a topic area, then a scoping review would probably be helpful. But if you were very interested, let's say in observational studies, you could limit your scoping review to observational studies. We don't typically do that. So I think it really comes down to, at the end of the day, what your question is. And then after you know what your question is, you can decide if you're going to do a scoping review or systematic review, and then you're going to decide what type of studies would be most relevant to that study question.
Awesome, thank you. One last question is related to where else to register the protocol. Is there another website that you could talk a little bit about this website that are options for registering protocol of scoping reviews?
Yes, yeah, so I did mention that, and I'll mention it again. So you can register your scoping review protocols on Figshare. So that's an online repository, or you could register it on Open Science Framework. Open Science Framework is probably more common to people, and we've registered several protocols on Open Science Framework for scoping reviews. If anyone's interested more in that, I have actually I've compiled quite a few of those protocols on Open Science Framework. So just send me an email and I can share all those resources with you.
You're going to put it on the chat, maybe. Is what you said? You're going to share the Open Science Framework?
Oh, you want me to share that? Yeah, I can share the link. I can share the link to Open Science Framework in the chat. Yes. Okay. Absolutely, I can. Yeah.
Okay, Andrea, thank you very much for your participation, for being here, for your time. I know you have a very busy schedule, and it's been a pleasure, as usual, to have you here.
Awesome, thank you so much. And again, any other questions, please feel free, everyone, to contact me at any point in time. Thank you so much. Nice to see you. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Yes. No. The idea is to have the discussion of both of you. That's okay. It's just Andrea that had to leave earlier. Thank you very much. Tenemos algunas preguntas para John y para Farid. I'm going to start with your question first. Farid has his own list of questions. So John, what are the challenges and opportunities to build networks between groups that work on evidence-informed decision-making globally and in our region?
What are the challenges in building networks that work on evidence-informed decision-making? And what was the end?
Between groups that work on evidence-informed decision-making globally and regionally. In Latin America, for instance.
Okay, so I'm probably not the person to answer the Latin American question, but I guess it's interesting, the McMaster Health Forum for a number of years kind of focused as a single entity, but then starting a number of years ago, we realized we could get farther, faster, learn more, and just have a bigger impact if we started to work in networks. So we started to work with the World Health Organization on a VIPNet, evidence-informed policy networks, and they're now operating in 55 countries. With COVID, you heard that we work with 55 different groups around the world. And the Evidence Commission was also a partnered enterprise. And I think the types of things that have made the big difference for us are regular topic-specific conversations where we're trying to advance particular conversations. And of course, GRADE has kind of perfected this approach of of identifying emergent issues where you need to get a bunch of very clever people around the table from very different contexts to work through the issue. And I think in our space of health policy and systems, grade tends to, from our perspective, be very focused on more kind of clinical stuff and doesn't have the same applicability in our world. But a lot of their methods we could be using in our networks in terms of that approach of the regular touch points, the working groups focused on particular topics, trying to establish standards that other people can follow. And that seems to have worked very well. I think we've had way too many years in our world of bringing people together without being focused on action-oriented tasks. And I think where we need to be in future is very task-oriented. What does the living evidence synthesis on strengthening health systems look like? How would that be different from a clinical one? Whatever the topic is. So I think it's one of many areas that we can learn from grade, take from the more clinical world and move into the world of more health policy and systems. So that would be my answer.
So, Farid, I noticed that you have a big list of questions. Go ahead if you want to select one of them or two to start.
Great. Hear me okay. So these are wonderful. I love every single one of these questions. The first question is asking, in clinical practice, I'm interested to know which is the best risk prediction model, not necessarily the average discrimination or calibration of the many published models. Could you please expand on the rationale of meta-analysis of risk prediction models? I think this is an excellent question. The meta-analysis of the performance of the prediction models is a starting point for us to answer the question, which is the best model out of all of the models that exist. And there are different approaches to answering the question of which is the best model. Obviously, some models are just developed and they stopped at development. So they're not externally validated. Can we trust that the performance that we see in the derivation cohort is going to be carried forward in the different settings that we want to apply the model? It's a very good question to ask. And many models don't make it to that next stage. Even after external validation, the performance metrics that we see of these models, like their discrimination and calibration, that's a surrogate for patient-important outcomes. We believe that when a model has a higher performance, that we're going to be better in caring for our patients, but there's many instances where that's not the case. Maybe we find a beautiful model that accurately predicts prognosis in our patients, but we don't know what to do with that information. We don't have the therapy, or the physicians don't know how to interact with the model to change patient-important outcomes. So further evidence is needed to ultimately answer the question, what is the best model out of all the models that exist? But it's a starting point for us to have the best available evidence on the performance of these models as best as possible from these external validation studies. And that's why we do these systematic reviews. In the example that I had on the slide, the forest plot, it wasn't one study in each row. That was one prediction model that was meta-analyzed in a systematic review of all prediction models. And that way we can actually see what is the discrimination of these models in relation to each other. And a panel of experts who were working on a guideline, they wanted to know which is the best performing model. And with the limited information that we have just from external validation studies, we were able to conclude that RECODE, out of all the models that exist in type 2 diabetes, had the best performance. Again, noting the limitations that we don't know if in fact it makes important differences on patient-important outcomes. So hopefully that answers that question. The next question, yeah, keep going. Okay, perfect. What's the best statistical software to do prognostic calculations? Is it possible to use Stata? Again, another really good question. I would say there are different packages, and it really depends on the type of prognosis question you're trying to answer. So overall prognosis, you're mostly doing meta-analyses of proportions because that's most widely used at the moment. Both R and Stata have metaprop packages that deal with binomial distributions that help you with balancing the weights across these studies. Because again, in proportions, just because a study has low probability doesn't mean that it's less important than a study that has high probability. And normally in traditional meta-analyses, when the event rates are low, we assign lower weight to those studies. We can't have that happen in overall prognosis, because a low probability is just as important as a high probability in conveying the message. So both STATA and R have meta-prop packages. For prognostic factors, you can do it in both STATA and R, and meta-analyses packages help you as long as you have your measure of association and you have a standard error or a confidence interval, you can do it. The performance of prediction models is where in R, we have a formal package from Cochrane that can do these meta-analyses for you, both in Bayesian and frequentist frameworks. In STATA, there's no formal package that I know of or have come across, but you could still try to do the meta-prop approach to statistics like discrimination, because again, at the end of the day, it's a measure that goes from 0 to 1, and there's an upper and a lower bound in terms of what your confidence intervals can be. So we need to just keep that in mind. But most of the packages are available in R, and for overall prognosis and prognostic factors, STATA is equally powerful.
Thank you, Farid. I think you'll have another question and then we'll come back to you again.
Excellent, perfect.
The question that I just gave to you. So what should we have in place regarding production and use of evidence synthesis in order to respond to a challenge like COVID-19?
So, similar to what I said in the presentation, I guess I'd focus on three things. One is you need a one-stop shop where decision makers anywhere in the world can go to find evidence syntheses on COVID-19. And they have to be quality rated. They have to have the date of last search extracted. And then if there's additional information you can provide, like, is there a great evidence profile, or something that we're interested in adding is, does this synthesis take an equity perspective on the question? So does it ask not just what we know on a specific question, but how does what we know vary by groups and contexts? So if that one-stop shop was there, and it's now there, but it wasn't at the beginning, if that one-stop shop is there, then the amount of duplication we would have ideally would be much less, and decision makers could find what they need. Second thing we need is a suite of living evidence syntheses. So, during the presentation on prognostic factors, I kept thinking back to the 3 times in COVID-19 when prognosis loomed so large. So the early days when people couldn't figure out, is it the obese, people with diabetes, the very elderly, who should we be most worried about with COVID-19? And everybody was saying, like, where do we get answers to these questions? Second time was when the vaccines started to become available and we couldn't give them to everybody. So the question was, well, who should we prioritize? Who's at greatest risk? And then when the drugs like Paxlovid started to become available, again, people were saying, well, where do we start? And it would have been so great to have, a set of living evidence syntheses that people could just keep coming back to. So if those existed, and we don't need all that many, and if they changed over time as the context for COVID changed, as the challenges that decision makers were facing changed, as the evidence changed, we would have been in a much better spot. And then the third is the biggest challenge, which is every country needs to have that capacity to take that global evidence and to put it alongside Colombia's data analytics, Colombia's modeling, Colombia's behavioral and implementation research, Colombia's evaluation, Colombia's qualitative research about how different communities in the country will respond to the idea of vaccines. And not many countries have that capacity. With this unit at Antioquia, you're now starting to have it here, which is absolutely critical. But you can't just have the global evidence sitting there. You need to have people in countries that can combine that national evidence with the global evidence. So those would be the three things: inventory, so people know where to go; the suites of living evidence syntheses that evolve over time as the evidence and the context changes; and then that domestic capacity to respond to questions from decision makers and combine national and global evidence.
Thank you, John. Farid.
Okay, so the next question for me was in prognosis, how can you expect that the hazard ratio has met the proportional hazard assumption? And that's one of the things that I said would be if it's met, then you can sort of consider that hazard ratio being applied with risk ratios and odds ratios at specific time points. And let me acknowledge, this is a unicorn. Again, it's one of those unicorns that we rarely see prognosis studies on prognostic factors reporting the statistical assumptions that they had to check in their studies. We have terrible reporting. And that's one of the aims with our systematic reviews, is to be transparent about these issues that we're seeing with the prognostic factor studies, so that we can move the community in the better direction, that the reporting standards are improved and that people are being clear, so that when we're doing these systematic reviews, we can have trust in these. Now, I always so in my field, when I see these prognostic factor studies, they never, maybe one study out of 50 reports that they checked for proportional hazard assumption and that they met it. And the other ones, I'm flagging that as a risk of bias issue. And then what we do is we have formulas that allow us to convert from hazard ratios to odds ratios. The challenge that we used to have was, how do we do it? Because the formulas require us to have a baseline risk. And that baseline risk is almost impossible to get if you're working in multivariable analyses, where the hazard ratio has been adjusted for many different things. That you can't have a baseline risk. Your baseline risk would be somebody who doesn't have any of those factors, and it never is reported. So what we did was, when I was in my PhD, we developed these formulas, and we worked out the math that if you have the prevalence of a prognostic factor, you have its measure of association, and you have the risk of the outcome in the overall cohort, you can put it into this calculator that we've developed. It's free, it's online, anybody can use it. And in the workshop, I'll be talking about how to use it. You can get the baseline risk in those who didn't have the prognostic factor. And then once you have that baseline risk, now you can start to convert your hazard ratio to odds ratios. So many times in our reviews, we end up converting hazard ratios to odds ratios so that we can combine them with the other studies that are reporting outcomes at a specific time point. Somebody asked, for prognosis, how do you explore the balance between specificity and sensitivity where you're when you're doing prediction or when you're developing prediction models? Why not choose a higher sensitivity? Okay, so the reason that typically in the world of prediction models, sensitivity and specificity is not the common statistics to report is because those two statistics depend on a particular specific threshold being set. So at the point that you get sensitivity and specificity, you've decided this is my threshold for which I'm saying that you are going to have the event, you're not going to have the event. And that may be at a specific probability above which you say, these are the people who are, I'm going to say high risk. And I've turned a continuous output of a model into a binary status of a yes or no. And we don't do that in prognosis because we leave it to folks to work with the model. The best performance of the model is its highest AUC that's being reported, or the C statistics that's being reported. That isn't set to a specific threshold. And it allows it to transcend to different applications. You want to communicate prognosis to your patient, you don't need a binary threshold. You can turn to your patient and say, I put your information into the model and my best estimate of your risk in the next 5 years is X amount. That is not a binary classification problem that needs sensitivity and specificity. So this is why we don't put a lot of emphasis on sensitivity and specificity in prognosis. And that is why many papers that are reporting on the performance of prediction models, they just leave it to discrimination reported with C statistics and area under the curve.
Thank you, Farid. John, what would be some examples of evidence support systems that may bring together global evidence and local evidence?
What are some examples of evidence support assistance?
Evidence support systems that bring together global evidence and local evidence.
Yeah, it's a great question, because right now they're mostly aspirational. I think the groups that try to provide evidence support tend to fall into the category of drawing primarily on one or a few forms of evidence. So our group is particularly focused on how do you, if we get a question, like I never know what my week's going to be like, because Monday morning I might have an email from the government saying by Wednesday morning, we need to know, what do we know about X? Last week or 2 weeks ago was monkeypox, where all of a sudden in 48 hours, what do we know about monkeypox? But our approach to that kind of question is to say, what evidence syntheses exist? And monkeypox has been around for a while, and there have been outbreaks outside of Africa. People had done systematic reviews. There were primary studies that could be pulled together. So in 48 hours, we could give that overview, but we came at it with an evidence synthesis perspective. If another group had been asked to do that, they might have done a very deep dive on data analytics about what we know about prevalence and a whole bunch of related data analytics type questions. A modeling group would have gone in a very different direction. What we don't yet have are the pathways for those groups to come together. And so one of the things we're very interested in is trying to design integrative evidence products that when you're trying to understand the problem, you can look at data analytics, other things. When you're trying to look at options, you can look at global evidence, but you can also do modeling. When you come to implementation considerations, the behavioral implementation research comes in. So I think the future is going to be one where a team that knows one form of evidence, whether that be global evidence synthesis or a form of national evidence, you're not going to be able to answer the question alone. You're going to have multi-functional teams that can come together. And if the call comes in on Monday, we do our part, they do their part. And by Wednesday morning, we needed to knit it together into that very difficult, one-page briefing note that the policymakers want. Just tell me everything you know in one page, and fine to share the appendices, but we just need the bottom line that draws from it. So it's a big step from where we are now with these different streams coming into decision makers to a world where we start to support them with a single integrative evidence product. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on that front.
A lot of work. One quick question that you could answer very quickly. One quick question. One final.
Okay, well, maybe I can do this one. It's could you please tell us a little bit more about the algorithm for the Kaplan-Meier, the survival curves? So this is Patricia Guyett. She's a individual. I think she lives in the States. She developed this algorithm as part of her PhD. The algorithm is a supplemental material as part of the publication, and the publication name is Secondary Enhancement of Recreation of Published Kaplan-Meier Curves. I'm happy to provide the link, and folks can get access to it. The way that it works is that you take a Kaplan-Meier curve that's published in a paper. You have to sort of do a screenshot of that graph. And then what we use is these digitization softwares where you input a graph, you determine the limits of the y-axis where it begins and ends, where the x-axis begins and ends. And based on the pixels that we see on the figure, we can tell where the line is, and when the line is, for example, at time 1 year, what was the specific probability? And we extract as many points from the Kaplan-Meier curve as is possible. The other pieces of information that it would be really helpful to have is how many people were at risk at each different time point on the Kaplan-Meier curve, and how many events were observed in total in that study. With these three inputs, so the specific probabilities at each time point, the number of people at risk, and the number of events, the algorithm works in R, so you need to have an understanding of R language to make it work. It takes the information, and the output is a simulated data set of individual patients, where every row is a different patient, and each patient has a given time and whether they experience the outcome or not. And that's all you get from it. So there's no more in terms of what was the age. And that is why when you saw that graph where I had the overall survival divided based on age, that was a median age of the studies. So again, it was a between study form of subgroup analysis looking at the impact that age of the cohorts have on the survival probabilities that were reported by each of those individual studies.
And that was the short answer. Thank you very much, Farid and John. Thank you for your presentation and for answering the questions. Los dejaré con Catalina, que le va a dar una información para el break.
Bueno, este es un anuncio antes de dar paso al receso. Nos encontramos un ticket de parqueadero, la placa termina en 463. Si el propietario se encuentra acá, me indica para yo devolverle el ticket del parqueadero. A quienes nos están acompañando de manera virtual, los invito para que ingresen. Ya les vamos a enviar por el chat el link que los va a reenviar a esta página que estamos proyectando en este momento. En ese enlace encuentran entonces, dice exposición de póster académicos participantes aquí. Ahí pueden ver entonces ya nuestra exposición virtual para que aprovechen este espacio e ingresen. A quienes nos están acompañando de manera presencial, los invito entonces a un breve receso para que regresemos a las 10:30 de la mañana. Los invito a que por favor vayan y observen, ya tenemos los póster expuestos en el hall y nos vemos entonces nuevamente para continuar con esta interesante jornada académica. Nuestros expositores, muchísimas gracias por aceptar esta invitación. Nos vemos entonces en 22 minutos. Si el propietario del parqueadero está aquí. Bienvenidos nuevamente. Continuamos con actualidad en la red. Retos Cochrane por el doctor Javier Bonfil. Él es doctor en medicina, especialista en oncología médica, máster en salud pública y especialista en medicina preventiva y salud pública. Es director del Servicio de Epidemiología Clínica y Salud Pública del Hospital Santa Cruz. También está en el Centro Cochrane Iberoamérica y a su vez es coordinador del programa de calidad asistencial del hospital. Es profesor titular de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona y coordinador del tercer ciclo del Departamento de Pediatría y Obstetricia y Ginecología y de Medicina Preventiva de la misma universidad, jefe del Grupo de Investigación en Epidemiología Clínica y Servicios Sanitarios. Está acreditado por diversos organismos científicos. Le damos entonces la bienvenida al doctor Xavier con esta conferencia.
Buenos días. Me alegro poder compartir con ustedes este rato. Desafortunadamente no ha podido ser de manera presencial, tampoco en una conexión directa por streaming, porque debido a un compromiso inesperado de última hora, aunque luego intentaremos estar disponibles por si hubiera alguna pregunta. En cualquier caso, esta intervención pregrabada me sirve para contribuir, intentar contribuir al menos al éxito de esta excelente iniciativa como es el segundo Simposio de Cochrane Colombia y para desarrollar el tema que se me pidió de hacer un cierto balance del punto en el que está la colaboración Cochrane, que yo he titulado Cochrane 1993, porque es el año en el que se fundó, 2022, luces y retos, no luces y sombras, porque las sombras hay que convertirlas en retos que seamos capaces de superar. En este rato que vamos a compartir, aunque sea en distintos momentos, me gustaría mencionar muy brevemente algunas referencias históricas que creo que hay que tener en cuenta desde la colaboración Cochrane para afrontar los retos de futuro y después valoraríamos los logros más importantes durante este periodo y apuntaría algunos de los muchos retos que tenemos pendientes. Suele decir que Cochrane, entre otras cosas, la colaboración Cochrane ha pretendido e intenta evaluar objetivamente los tratamientos. Esta es un esfuerzo titánico por diferentes motivos que la humanidad lleva intentando desde hace siglos y la James Lynn Library es un excelente recurso que les invito a consultar, aquellos que no conozcan, donde encontrarán contribuciones importantes a la evaluación de los tratamientos a lo largo de la historia, lógicamente de manera más intensificada en las últimas décadas. También me gustaría señalar a Archie Cochrane como gran referente, no solo porque la colaboración Cochrane toma el nombre de Archie, sino porque en sus escritos, en sus aportaciones se encuentran, a mi entender, muchas de los retos o de las estrategias que cualquier persona o organización interesada en mejorar la salud de las poblaciones debería tener en cuenta. Archie Cochrane fue un pionero en muchas cosas. Se ha conocido en relación a la colaboración Cochrane, sobre todo por su reclamo de las revisiones sistemáticas. Sin duda, toda la parte de investigación epidemiológica tiene una relación menos directa, pero vale la pena reivindicar sus aportaciones en el marco de lo que hoy llamamos pensamiento crítico, de los ensayos clínicos controlados, de la evaluación de servicios sanitarios y las propias revisiones sistemáticas, incluso de lo que aportó como ejemplo de humanidad, humanismo y compromiso, porque están en la base de la fundación de la colaboración Cochrane. No puedo extenderme tanto como creo que sería interesante en el pensamiento de Archie Cochrane. Pasaré de puntillas sobre algunas de estas menciones o contribuciones más destacadas, pero como tendrán a su disposición estas diapositivas, espero que les anime para releer o de alguna manera interpretar nuevamente una figura tan importante, incluso más allá de lo que ha sido dar el nombre a nuestra organización. Sus invectivas y preguntas a veces provocativas, poniendo en cuestión las prácticas clínicas, están en la base de lo que hoy conocemos como pensamiento crítico o como incluso medicina basada en la evidencia. Su reivindicación de los ensayos clínicos no solo circunscritos a los tratamientos farmacológicos, sino a todo tipo de tratamientos, o la flexibilidad demostrada para defender los ensayos clínicos, pero a la vez entender y justificar que a veces hay otros diseños que son más apropiados. También su primer y peor, según sus propias palabras, y más exitoso ensayo clínico que desarrolló en un campo de concentración nazi, permite argumentar que los ensayos clínicos son una técnica para evaluar tratamientos y que se pueden desarrollar a veces en circunstancias muy difíciles. A veces los ensayos clínicos dan la impresión que solo pueden desarrollar grandes corporaciones o grupos multinacionales con muchos recursos, y este es un buen ejemplo de que en circunstancias que no son las más propicias también se pueden evaluar intervenciones sanitarias. Otro aspecto interesante que es muy actual también es cuando nos dicen desde algunas voces o a veces intereses que los ensayos clínicos son algo obsoleto y que hay que pasar al real world evidence. No podemos desmenuzar ahora mismo todo lo que está detrás de esta argumentación, pero simplemente diría que, con las palabras de Archie Cochrane, que a veces hay que sacrificar algo de la libertad de prescribir a cambio de aportar conocimiento útil, conocimiento sólido, que a la hora de comparar los tratamientos, en la gran mayoría de las veces, solo nos pueden aportar los ensayos clínicos. También en un mundo en el que las fake news y la investigación redundante e interesada está a la orden del día, sin duda el llamado de Cochrane para reducir tantos estudios pseudocientíficos es un aspecto que todavía nos debe preocupar. El libro Efectividad y Eficiencia en su momento se convirtió en un pequeño bestseller dentro del ámbito académico. Está todavía disponible, es muy vigente y en él vemos un alegato continuo y metodológico de Cochrane para que los servicios de salud se orienten a la efectividad y a la eficiencia, y también para su sostenibilidad. es decir, de qué manera, mediante la investigación, podríamos ir identificando aquellas intervenciones que merecen ser financiadas con fondos públicos y aquellas otras que deberían ser excluidas porque aportan realmente muy poco valor. Sin duda, en las páginas de este libro se encuentra también lo que hoy llamamos intentos de mejorar la adecuación sanitaria. Hacer más no siempre es mejor. Cómo identificar estas prácticas más adecuadas, estas prácticas más coste efectivas, y de tal manera que la responsabilidad de los clínicos no sea solo con los pacientes individuales, sino que tengan una visión más amplia, más comunitaria y, por lo tanto, favorezca la equidad en el acceso y el coste-oportunidad también de las distintas intervenciones. Hay otras muchas propuestas en el campo de los servicios sanitarios. Si tienen la paciencia de leerlas, verán que muchas de ellas están plenamente vigentes en los años que nos toca vivir. Las revisiones sistemáticas fue el punto de enganche entre la visión y el pensamiento de Archie Cochrane con lo que algunos de sus discípulos más cercanos, como Ian Chalmers, utilizaron para justificar y diseñar lo que sería después la colaboración Cochrane. Él criticaba precisamente la ausencia de estas síntesis actualizadas periódicamente para informar bien las decisiones. De modo que en el año 1993, casi 30 años atrás, nace la colaboración Cochrane con el objetivo de preparar, actualizar y divulgar revisiones sistemáticas sobre los efectos de la atención sanitaria, y se incorpora como logo el estudio interesantísimo la revisión, mejor dicho, de los diferentes ensayos que evalúan los efectos de administrar corticoides a las embarazadas amenazadas de parto prematuro, precisamente como homenaje al grupo pionero de obstetras, comadronas, etcétera, neonatólogos que fueron los que primero desarrollaron estas revisiones sistemáticas. Posteriormente, la colaboración Campbell también recogió el guante lanzado por Archie Cochrane, que decía que esta misma necesidad de evaluación podía extenderse al campo social y educativo. La colaboración Cochrane, por tanto, nace con unos principios bien explícitos para desarrollarse como lo que decía su nombre original, como una colaboración, y proporcionar información útil a través de estas revisiones sistemáticas. Por ello, ahora, casi 30 años después, creo que es un buen momento, todos lo son, obviamente, para recordarnos unos a otros los logros más importantes y, sobre todo, ver cuáles son los muchos retos pendientes y cómo podemos abordarlos. Para ello, yo he recogido aquí, y esta es una lista absolutamente personal, quizá me da una cierta credibilidad el hecho de que he estado involucrado activamente en Cochrane desde el año 1994, de modo que, a mi entender, vale la pena ser conscientes y congratularnos de que hoy tenemos una red mundial bien estructurada, bien consolidada y prestigiosa, tanto en ámbitos académicos como asistenciales, científicos, etc. Tenemos una presencia activa en la mayoría de países de todo el mundo, con una organización democrática, independiente y suficientemente transparente. Se han publicado durante este periodo miles de revisiones sistemáticas en todos los campos de la atención sanitaria, también en aquellos que no caen de lleno en el campo de la llamada medicina convencional, sino también intervenciones complementarias o alternativas han sido sometidas al mismo proceso de evaluación. Asimismo, y sobre todo en los últimos años, se han publicado centenares de revisiones no terapéuticas, diagnósticas, pronósticas, etcétera, que no eran una realidad en los primeros años de la colaboración. Se ha desarrollado un corpus metodológico muy sofisticado en los distintos campos y sobre todo de la lectura crítica y de la síntesis, y sin duda estos referentes Cochrane han tenido influencia no solo en la propia colaboración, sino en muchas publicaciones cuando se han hecho eco de este tipo de estudios. Se han desarrollado también revisiones de distinto formato al convencional, al inicial, revisiones rápidas, overviews, metaanálisis en red, etc. Se han diseñado y llevado a cabo en todo el mundo numerosas y diversas actividades de formación para todos los interesados, no solamente profesionales de la salud, también pacientes, ciudadanos, periodistas, estudiantes, etc. Millones de usuarios han podido consultar la Cochrane Library, que se ha ido sofisticando cada vez más como una fuente de información interesante, completa y amigable, y a la vez se han diseñado y se han podido consultar otros materiales más allá de los existentes en la Cochrane Library. También millones de usuarios han podido acceder en español a la biblioteca Cochrane, así como a otros materiales, y debemos congratularnos de que realmente este idioma, el idioma español, haya sido el pionero a la hora de abrir estas publicaciones a otros idiomas que progresivamente también van incorporando estos materiales. Al principio, la colaboración Cochrane se definía como colaboración Cochrane y ponía el énfasis en las revisiones sistemáticas. A lo largo de estos años se ha reducido por razones de comunicación el nombre de Cochrane, aunque sigue manteniéndose el primer principio de la colaboración como el que sustenta una organización como esta, y también se ha anotado un nuevo lema, el de evidencia fiable, decisiones informadas y mejor salud, precisamente para apuntar que no es suficiente y no sea suficiente con producir evidencia fiable, sino que el reto debe ser también trasladar esta evidencia fiable para que las decisiones sean lo más informadas posibles y acaben redundando en una mejor salud. Se han desarrollado y utilizado diversos formatos de comunicación y de transferencia al conocimiento, un nuevo término acuñado en estos años. Se han utilizado webs, redes sociales, apps, audios, vídeos, etc. También los pacientes, estudiantes, ciudadanos, etc. han participado en los diversos niveles de responsabilidad de la colaboración Cochrane, y sin duda en este sentido es una organización singular. Al principio estaba basada la estrategia solo en la colaboración desinteresada, individual y en el entusiasmo de las personas, pero sin duda se ha ido poniendo de manifiesto que necesitábamos aliarnos de manera estratégica con otras organizaciones tales como la OMS, Wikipedia, GIN, All Trials, epistemónicos, etc. Y por último, creo que vale la pena destacar que Cochrane ha sido capaz de responder ante una situación de emergencia sanitaria global como ha sido la pandemia de COVID-19 y producir materiales que han ayudado a paliar en la medida de lo posible esta situación. ¿Cuáles serían, nuevamente, a mi entender, algunos de los muchos retos pendientes? Bueno, hemos de mejorar todavía más el funcionamiento de las diferentes redes a nivel global, por regiones, por países, etc. Hemos de incrementar la presencia en todos los países e instituciones. Hemos de mejorar la participación de todos los miembros para que cada uno pueda encontrar el lugar donde hacer contribuciones relevantes y para evitar la redundancia, la posible redundancia en todas esas tareas. Sin duda, Cochrane debe priorizar la publicación de revisiones de calidad y alto impacto. A veces esto no ha sido una realidad en los últimos años y sin duda el público, la población, las instituciones, etcétera, esperan que demos respuesta a estas incertidumbres que continuamente tenemos en el marco asistencial y sanitario con revisiones que sean realmente indiscutibles por su calidad. Para ello hay que reducir, hay que ser más eficientes los tiempos de edición y publicación para poder disponer cuanto antes de estos materiales. Hay que continuar con la investigación metodológica, profundizando en lo que ya se ha conseguido, abordando los nuevos retos que van apareciendo. Cochrane debe ser muy activo reclamando la calidad y transparencia de la investigación primaria, entre otros motivos, porque esta investigación primaria, sobre todo los ensayos clínicos, son los que luego alimentan las revisiones sistemáticas. Se ha avanzado bastante, pero falta todavía mejorar mucho más la interrelación entre las revisiones sistemáticas y el desarrollo de las guías, de tal manera que se constituya un verdadero ecosistema de la evidencia que vaya desde las incertidumbres, los estudios primarios, las revisiones, la síntesis.
Para quienes están conectados, nuevamente tuvimos una caída masiva de internet en el edificio de extensión desde donde estamos transmitiendo el evento en vivo. Solicitamos excusas por esta interrupción. Como estábamos viendo la conferencia del doctor Xavier, les vamos a compartir por el chat de Zoom en este momento un link de nuestro canal de YouTube de la Facultad de Medicina, donde vamos a subir la grabación para que ustedes puedan verla nuevamente sin ninguna interrupción. Nuevamente reiteramos las excusas por el inconveniente ocasionado. Y para continuar entonces con nuestra programación académica, quiero invitar con la plenaria experiencias, revisiones rápidas y revisiones vivas en la toma de decisiones, y nos la va a moderar el doctor Iván Flores. Él es el director de Cochrane Colombia. También estará con usted el doctor Fabián, ¿cierto? Bueno, el doctor entonces va a invitar a quienes lo acompañarán en esta plenaria.
Invito entonces, por favor, acá a la plenaria a los doctores Fabio Sierra, Daniel Patiño y John Davis. Please, can you come here, please? Por cuestiones de tiempo, para agilizar, un rápido resumen, porque los tres invitados que tenemos hoy son personas que han tenido bastante experiencia en los temas que vamos a hablar, específicamente el profesor John Davis, que como escucharon, coordinó la iniciativa COVID-N y el McMaster Health Forum, y tiene mucha experiencia en apoyo a la toma de decisiones en revisiones rápidas y revisiones vivas. Profesor Daniel Patiño, de aquí en nuestra universidad, coordinador de la UNED, también ha trabajado mucho en el tema de revisiones rápidas, con mucha experiencia en el tema de revisiones rápidas en respuesta a temas de COVID-19, y el doctor Fabio Sierra, quien es epidemiólogo del IETS, ha tenido experiencia apoyando el desarrollo de estas revisiones que se han utilizado para informar decisiones a nivel de ministerio y otros tomadores de decisiones en el país, en sistema de salud. Entonces, el interés de esta plenaria es dialogar un poco sobre los retos cuando hemos migrado del tema de la tradicional revisión sistemática de literatura, Cochrane o no Cochrane, que nos lleva meses y hasta años para desarrollar, a dos temas que han tomado mucho impulso en la época de la pandemia, que son las revisiones rápidas y las revisiones vivas. Ambos temas se venían trabajando desde antes de la pandemia y han habido mucho interés en promocionarlas, sobre todo las revisiones rápidas, que teóricamente son más cortas, más prácticas, y las revisiones vivas como un ideal de una revisión, porque todos hemos notado el reto que tenemos con mantener las revisiones actualizadas, sobre todo en temas donde la evidencia va a un ritmo bastante alto. Entonces, por ello, diversas organizaciones, incluyendo Cochrane u otras, han trabajado, por ejemplo, en desarrollar manuales para hacer revisiones rápidas que permitan informar rápidamente, como les mostró John en la mañana, con periodos cortos de 3 a 5 días, de una semana, o con respuestas de un poquito más, hasta de un mes. Y ahí vienen muchos retos metodológicos, como muchos de nosotros sabemos. y es cuáles son los atajos, qué se puede acelerar en el proceso, que no, y cuál ha sido la experiencia de los grupos que han hecho esto a nivel local y a nivel internacional. Y el tema de revisiones vivas tiene el tema, por supuesto, de esa revisión ideal, que todos queremos que las revisiones, la síntesis se actualicen en la medida que la evidencia sale. Entonces, para eso tengo algunas preguntas. Como tenemos aquí un invitado de habla inglesa, vamos a tratar de darle las preguntas que hemos recolectado para responder primero en español con las preguntas y luego le haré a John las preguntas en inglés para los temas. Entonces quiero escuchar primero al doctor Fabio que nos cuente un poco rápidamente, de manera muy corta, qué experiencias han tenido con el tema de revisiones rápidas. Vamos a hablar solo de revisiones rápidas primero, desde el IETS para el uso y su uso y cómo se han utilizado y los retos que han tenido en esta materia de revisiones rápidas en el IETS. Doctor Fabio.
Muchas gracias, doctor Iván. Buenos días, todos y todas. Bueno, afortunadamente hemos trabajado con muchos de los que están aquí en el auditorio y pues podrían dar cuenta de lo que voy a decir. Como ustedes saben, en el sistema de salud colombiano se implementó desde el 2017 el proceso de exclusiones. El proceso de exclusiones pues busca sacar de la financiación con recursos públicos asignados a la salud aquellas tecnologías que no cumplen unos ciertos criterios. Dos de esos criterios son que no haya evidencia científica sobre su eficacia clínica y seguridad, y el otro que no haya evidencia sobre efectividad. ¿Qué pasa? Que por los tiempos que tiene el ministerio, esas nominaciones se hacen en periodos de 4 meses. Por lo tanto, hay que hacer la revisión sistemática rápida en ese periodo máximo. De hecho, hay un cierto tiempo administrativo. Ese proceso pues, fue el que dio el lugar a que el instituto planteara otro tipo de metodología para poder responder y para que el tomador de decisiones tuviese la mejor evidencia con la mayor certeza disponible para pues, informar al Ministerio de Salud y Protección Social y ellos tomasen la decisión pues, de excluir o no. Como les digo, pues desde 2017 se viene trabajando en este proceso, entonces se ha hecho por lo menos unas 50 revisiones rápidas, de hecho ustedes nos han colaborado en algunas. Ese es como el proceso más fuerte. Sin embargo, cuando se dio la pandemia COVID, también el ministerio solicitó una serie de revisiones de varios de los temas que habían, vacunas, todos esos procesos de lavado, desinfectado, etcétera. Y ahí se hicieron 20 revisiones sistemáticas rápidas y otras convencionales. También para la Dirección de Medicamentos del Ministerio IETS ha hecho revisiones rápidas enfocadas en pruebas diagnósticas. Entonces, digamos que durante estos años ha surgido el reto de cómo hacerlo y se ha ido como perfeccionando el cómo hacerlo, ¿sí? De hecho, pues en el taller que tendremos con algunos en la tarde, vamos a dar cuenta de actualmente cuál es el proceso metodológico y cómo este está afinado con los estándares que ha propuesto la colaboración Cochrane en su publicación del 2021.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias, Fabio. Daniel, no sé si puedes contar un poco de la experiencia de la UNED con revisiones rápidas, como cuántas revisiones han hecho y para informar a qué tomadores de decisiones.
Nosotros, bueno, la unidad es un grupo muy reciente. La unidad la creamos a finales del 2019, o a mitad del 2019 más o menos. Aquí tenemos a muchos de los participantes de la unidad, Viviana, Isa, Pamela, Claudia también está por aquí. Y la unidad se crea con esa intención de informar las decisiones de tomadores de decisiones con diferentes tipos de productos. Revisiones rápidas, resúmenes de evidencia para política, ayudas de decisiones para pacientes, informar decisiones con síntesis de evidencia para diferentes públicos.
And so for us, what's really important to say is that the unit of focus is typically a synthesis. So we are synthesizing existing syntheses typically. Partly because of the complexity of the question, there's a variety of reasons why that makes sense. Because if somebody is saying to us, how do we improve vaccine rollout? And you have to give us the answer in 3 days. There may be 37 systematic reviews that speak to different pieces of it. And our job is to say, what can we pull from that would be appropriate for our content? The other role that we play is as an intermediary to people that do rapid syntheses in the sense of a rapid synthesis of primary studies on a focused question. And there We handle the intake, so people send in a request form, we send back a one-page scoping document, then we have a scoping call with the decision makers to make sure we understand everything and that the scoping document is correct, and then we finalize the scoping document. And that often has to happen within 24 hours, at most 48 hours, and then it goes out to whatever the right team is across the country that can answer it. So keep in mind, for most of our work, our unit is we're synthesizing syntheses, as opposed to when we're the intermediary, we're doing a rapid syntheses of primary studies. And then order of magnitude, I mentioned for COVID, we ended up doing roughly 10 rapid syntheses a month. That was kind of steady state. But if we weren't in a crisis, we would more likely be doing kind of one to three a month order of magnitude. So we've done many, many hundreds, but that's roughly the scale.
And usually, John, those who you are informing, only decision makers in Canada or across the globe?
We are, I mean, perhaps not unlike you, we have no core funding. So
Okay.
everything we do has to be under a contract. So the majority of our contracts that are specific to rapid synthesis work are from Canada. So we have agreements with our federal government, with 2 provincial governments, at times with large organizations. So this type of work tends to be for Canada because A, we have the contracts there, B, because it needs to be contextualized. We know Canada inside and out, but we would not be the right person to write a document for another country. So when we're involved in that work, we're often there in a role of helping people methodologically, but they're the ones that have to drive the bus because they know the context, they have the relationships and so on.
So that's more like a collaboration rather
Yes,
than you
exactly.
are the main author. Okay, perfect. Thank you, John. Fabio, pues, con este tema de las revisiones rápidas normalmente tenemos muchos retos metodológicos y entiendo que ustedes tienen este manual de revisiones o de los procesos metodológicos que tienen que llevarse a cabo. ¿Cuáles han sido los retos metodológicos más importantes que han tenido estableciendo esas revisiones rápidas? ¿Y hasta qué punto los que leen las revisiones rápidas ya probablemente no quieran volver a las revisiones largas? Digamos, ya están haciendo revisiones de 4 meses. Entonces, ¿por qué no seguimos haciendo revisiones siempre de 4 meses? Fabio.
Bueno, digamos que con la evolución o con el paso de estos años se han probado diferentes propuestas para agilizar el proceso, ¿sí? O sea, la idea de la revisión rápida, como la hemos concebido, pues no es disminuir la calidad o rigor metodológico, sino acelerar procesos dados los límites de tiempo que hemos tenido. Hay unos que son claves que nos han servido bastante y el primero es el de dialogar la pregunta con el solicitante, en este caso el Ministerio de Salud y Protección Social. ¿Por qué? Con ellos definimos cuál es el comparador, que tiene que ser algún comparador que esté disponible financiado en el país y por lo tanto pues ya limitamos un poco la cantidad de información que se va a obtener y los desenlaces siempre los hemos graduado para también discutiendo con ellos cuáles serían los claves para la toma de decisión y se incluirían con los críticos. Esto de entrada. Otro aspecto metodológico que ha sido también pues, un reto y lo hemos venido también puliendo y ha funcionado es hacer la búsqueda de manera secuencial, ¿sí? Entonces, en los criterios de elegibilidad planteamos en primer lugar buscar ya síntesis hecha, o sea, otras revisiones sistemáticas de la literatura, revisiones de revisiones, etcétera. Si no hay información, bajarse estudios primarios, en primer lugar experimentos clínicos, luego estudios de cohortes, siempre apostándole a la mejor evidencia. Y también con eso hay una ganancia adicional de tiempo. Nosotros no hacemos la tamización, por ejemplo, que uno tamice y el otro revisa. Siempre la hemos hecho duplicada. En algún momento probamos hacerla de esa manera, que es uno de los atajos que han hecho algunos, pero encontramos que había pérdida de estudios, entonces dejamos de hacerlo. Pero en la selección por texto completo sí nos ha funcionado que un primer revisor revise todos los artículos y que un segundo revise los excluidos, para que pues, no haya ahí falsos negativos. El otro reto grande es, bueno, ¿qué extraemos y qué sintetizamos? Entonces también hemos llegado al punto de seleccionar las que serían variables clave para la toma de decisiones. ¿Sí? de manera que se pueda dar la respuesta al Ministerio de Salud, Protección Social en sus diferentes unidades o divisiones. Y la síntesis la hemos hecho en su mayoría en un formato narrativo. Claro que esto depende pues de la cantidad de información que haya, ¿sí? Puede que haya poca información, que la información sea homogénea, metodológica, clínicamente hablando y también de manera estadística. Entonces, en algunos casos hemos logrado hacer metaanálisis, por ejemplo, en casos de pruebas diagnósticas, etc. Pues hay muchos más, pero estos son, digamos, los retos principales pues, para abreviar de todo el proceso que pues, hemos encontrado y que con estas salidas pues, hemos llegado como a agilizar bastante ese resultado.
Una pregunta antes de seguir con Daniel. Como hay atajos y como hay que recortar el proceso, ¿les ha ocurrido que en la revisión, cuando entregan el reporte, alguien les dice, te faltó este estudio, te faltó este otro? ¿Cómo han manejado esto, dado de que no se está haciendo todo el proceso completo en duplicado, full?
Sí. Sí, lo hemos tenido y lo hemos tenido ya en contextos en los que se está utilizando la información para la toma de decisiones. Un ejemplo concreto en el proceso de exclusiones, en el cual se presenta la evidencia que ha recolectado IEDS y pues está alguno que, por ejemplo, hicimos la revisión basado en revisiones sistemáticas y está alguien que leyó el último estudio primario que no estaba en las revisiones. Nos ha tocado hacer el ejercicio. Afortunadamente, pues el equipo es grande. Digamos que la revisión no está reposando en una persona, sino en el equipo, de hacer una revisión súper rápida de esa evidencia y mirar en qué sentido complementa o en qué sentido va en otro rumbo o disminuye la certeza o nos dice un determinado efecto. O sea, una revisión en tiempo real de esa evidencia precisa. Por supuesto, nos toca declarar en los informes que parte de las limitaciones del informe es que se hizo una revisión sistemática rápida y que pues esto tiene algunas limitaciones, entre esas pues perder algún tipo de información relevante para el tomador de decisiones. Con esta limitación, digamos que estamos, bueno, para responder la segunda pregunta que nos hizo, tratando de decirle al lector, mire, esto se hizo para tomar una decisión, pero interésese en ver el resultado completo de la revisión convencional, que es el que le va a decir exactamente cuál es la certeza, cuál es la evidencia que hay. Pienso yo que dar esa declaración, decir es para una toma de decisión que fue urgente, no desmotivaría a los interesados en las revisiones sistemáticas convencionales en seguirla leyendo.
Perfecto. Daniel, no sé si puedes comentar sobre los retos metodológicos, los atajos que se han tomado en revisiones rápidas y cómo es el proceso actualmente y el tema de la revisión en duplicado y este tipo de pasos en las revisiones rápidas.
En temas de retos, uno que quiero mencionar es estas síntesis de evidencia rápidas nos generan un reto en la financiación y en la manera en que contratamos las personas y pagamos las personas. Antes, cuando hacíamos una revisión sistemática convencional, que nos demorábamos un año o un poco más haciendo una revisión sistemática convencional, pues podíamos armar el equipo, hacer el trabajo en el tiempo que teníamos, contratar las personas. Una síntesis rápida que te piden una respuesta en 10 días, en 15 días, en 30 días, pues tiene un reto metodológico que implica tener como una financiación global que soporte todo ese proyecto de síntesis de evidencia, lo cual en las universidades es un reto muy difícil, ¿cierto? Nosotros nos financiamos específicamente por proyectos particulares que tienen un producto que presentarnos, que nos den una financiación para, este es un rubro para que usted haga las síntesis que le quepan ahí. Entonces, las síntesis rápidas han puesto un reto importante en la administración y en la gestión del recurso humano de estos trabajos. En cuanto a los atajos, yo creo que hay varios tipos de atajos en las diferentes etapas de las revisiones sistemáticas que se han tomado dependiendo de cuándo tienen que la revisión sistemática informar la decisión. Una pregunta muy interesante sería, después de que se han hecho todas estas revisiones rápidas, es si los resultados a los que se llegó con una revisión rápida son iguales o cambian si se hubiera hecho una revisión completa. Y eso puede ser una pregunta interesante en algún momento, porque el impacto de los atajos que estamos tomando para hacer las revisiones rápidas no se ha evaluado. Nosotros los atajos principales que tenemos es, primero, empezar por una búsqueda muy estrecha de tiempo. Si tenemos que contestar una pregunta rápidamente y es un tema sobre el que se publica mucho, cogemos los últimos 2 años. Por ejemplo, hace poco hicimos tema cannabis medicinal, el trabajo que les presentaron ayer sobre el resumen de evidencia de cannabis medicinal es una síntesis de evidencia de revisiones sistemáticas solo publicadas desde el 2018 para acá y la cantidad de información fue enorme. Entonces, dependiendo del tema, el primer atajo es los años de la búsqueda, el segundo es incluir solo síntesis de evidencia. En la síntesis, si el tiempo es muy corto, si el tiempo permite más, si hay más tiempo, incluimos síntesis de evidencia y estudios individuales que estén más actuales que la última síntesis de evidencia. Ese es como el segundo. En el tema de screening, de tamización, en la unidad siempre hacemos screening de títulos y resúmenes por 2 autores de manera independiente y si hay tiempo hacemos la inclusión de full text por 2 personas de manera independiente, si no la inclusión del full text lo hace solo un revisor. Y en extracción, creo que es la parte más, extracción y evaluación de la calidad es la parte más demorada. En extracción generalmente dividimos la cantidad de información que hay que extraer entre diferentes personas del equipo, igual para la evaluación de la calidad, pero si la evaluación de la calidad tenemos un poco de tiempo, a esa le ponemos más énfasis y lo hacemos por 2 revisores de manera independiente. La síntesis de la información generalmente la hacemos narrativa. Solo creo que hemos hecho una síntesis de evidencia, y Vivi me dice si sí, una síntesis de evidencia que hicimos un meta-análisis. El resto han sido síntesis narrativas.
Okay. Gracias, Daniel. John, could you let us know a little bit about the both methodological challenges with rapid reviews in comparison to full reviews, and also technical and also financial challenges that you have had in your experience?
I think the thing that we find the most challenging is right from the beginning is scoping the question appropriately. It's amazing, you know, and I mentioned before, we often have to do it in 24 or 48 hours, and we have a process of a structured form that comes in that tells us what's the question, what do you already know, how quickly do you need it, a variety of things that help us then write the scoping note. Then that goes back, and then we have a phone call, and then it turns out there's a lot more information context-wise that we need to know to produce a good result. You know, the federal government doesn't have this policy lever available, so there's no point looking at it and other things. And then we finalize the scoping note. But that process of coming to a question that will add value in decision-making is a really big challenge. And I think our process now works as good as any other thing we've tried, but we'll have to keep working on it. On the financial front, and you know, the sustainability front more generally, 2 things. One is having to move beyond like a fee-for-service model where every time a request comes in, you have to figure out how to set up a new contract, to a model where you have contracts for a suite of products. So we thankfully now have these with a variety of governments where there's X amount of dollars on the table, and we keep giving them updates saying we produce 3 2-day, we produce 10 5-day, we produce 6 10 day, 20 day, and then we know where the budget is at any moment in time. But that means the moment that the request comes in, we don't have to deal with contracts because the contract already is there, the money is sitting there, we're ready to go. But the other thing is about having a team that you can hit go with, and so we've developed mechanisms where everything gets delegated down to the most junior person who can do stuff. So when a question comes in, if it comes in Thursday morning, we need the report by Friday afternoon. We have to phone, send out an email to all of our very young staff. They're 18, 19, 20. They're doing their undergraduate degrees, but they've been trained to do AmStar scores, a variety of things. Who's around on Thursday and Friday morning who can do these and get them back? So the work cascades down, and then it cascades back up to that final writing. And I tend to be involved at the front and the back end, but not all of the stuff in the middle. So that's another key piece for sustainability. On the technical front, and Danielle said this yesterday, in his comments that we always say to work with us, you need 5 skills. Evidence synthesis is 1. Stakeholder engagement is another, because a lot of our work is about talking to these decision makers and understanding the situation. And then you need 3 types of analytical skills, which Daniel spoke about. Policy analysis, slicing and dicing policy problems, options, implementation, systems analysis, because you're never starting with a clean slate. There's a whole bunch of things in place already and you're trying to shift it. And political analysis to see those windows of opportunity. So that's another methodological challenge, is to have staff who have those skills so that they can be thinking that way as they're processing the evidence and not waiting for us at the back end. And then some other methodological things are the ability to quickly find frameworks that help you come at an issue in a particularly helpful way. If it's equity, you might just say, oh, well, we'll use Progress Plus. But if it's about public health functions, there may be a framework for those that you need to be able to pull on. And the final technical issue that we think is critically important, because we can never predict the question that will come in, is you need to be really good at knowing where your sources of best evidence are. So, you know, monkeypox was such a surprise to us because we don't usually work in that space. But all of a sudden we could find shops around the globe that were moving really fast that we could start to draw content from. So anytime it's a question out of the blue, you need to know the existing one-stop shops and other places that are high-yield sources of evidence that you can turn to.
Thank you, John. ¿Quieren comentar algo más sobre revisiones rápidas, Daniel o Fabio? Porque tenemos también que abordar el tema de revisiones vivas un poco, entonces no sé si quieres comentar algo más o Daniel.
Una sola cosa. John mencionó como el tipo de habilidades que son un reto tener en los equipos. Personas con habilidades que hagan análisis de sistemas, personas con habilidades que hagan análisis político, personas que sepan hacer stakeholder engagement, que sepan, digamos, involucrar a los actores claves, y bueno, y personas con experticia en síntesis de evidencia. Todo este grupo y todos pues, los que están aquí presentes y en Cochrane son muy expertos en la parte metodológica de la síntesis de evidencia, ¿cierto? De aplicar riesgo de sesgo, de hacer extracción, de hacer esas otras habilidades de hacer análisis de sistema político, análisis de sistemas de salud. Es un reto y los equipos tienen que empezar a involucrar personas con esas habilidades.
Algo adicional en esa vía también, nosotros constituimos un equipo conformado pues expertos en metodología cuando se requiere en economía de la salud, en química cuando son moléculas y por supuesto se requiere el apoyo del especialista en clínica para ayudar a hacer todo el trabajo de la revisión. Y por otro lado, pues no olvidar que también el uso de software pues ha ayudado a agilizar bastantes procesos, ¿sí? Entonces, por ejemplo, estos programas para tamizar como el Ryan, el Coevidence, nos han facilitado muchísimo el trabajo. No hemos explorado, lo vamos a estudiar, por ejemplo, estas inteligencias artificiales que ayudan a tamizar, pues para mirar si sea algo que se pueda implementar en este tipo de revisiones.
Esa era precisamente la otra pregunta que le iba a hacer, si habían explorado el tema de la inteligencia artificial o lo habían considerado. Me dice que no lo habían.
Lo vamos a estudiar.
Y por el lado de acá tampoco.
No, nosotros no, también estamos ahí como mirando en el horizonte a ver qué tan bien funcionan esos algoritmos de inteligencia artificial para hacer screening. Incluso vi uno que hacía extracción de información.
John, artificial intelligence. Have you explored the using artificial intelligence, machine learning, these processes in the rapid reviews, or have you explored that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're novices at it, but one of the things that we committed to do a month or two ago is start to build out connections who can better to people who can better leverage that. So I think we're still using brute force strength with 20 people on tasks that could be streamlined, and I work every day with my colleague Alfonso Iorio, but I don't extract from him enough insights about how to keep up with new developments that would allow us to reduce the brute force elements of our work.
Perfecto. El otro tema que nos compete el día de hoy es el tema de las revisiones vivas. Todos hemos visto con con COVID, que esto ha explotado bastante, pero como les decía previamente, esto venía trabajándose de antes. Y es algo que está jugando un papel importante, como tal vez de pronto John nos puede contar ahora, para los decision makers, los tomadores de decisiones, porque hay una oportunidad de mantenerse al día, de tener un reporte que va más al día a lo que está pasando en la evidencia. No sé si Fabio nos puede contar un poco sobre si el IEDS ha considerado hasta qué punto las revisiones vivas pueden ser una oportunidad para hacerlo. Si lo están trabajando, pues nos puede dar una idea, o es algo que no se ha considerado.
Vale. Bueno, lo primero que hay que decir es que no las hemos trabajado todavía en el instituto. Sin embargo, consideramos que sí son una oportunidad clave para ciertos procesos. Pues recordar que la revisión viva responde a una pregunta para una toma de decisiones, que muy probablemente la evidencia que tenemos hasta el momento es de baja certeza y sabemos que hay evidencia en camino. Digamos que pensando en esas tres características, hay tres procesos en el instituto que son claves. Uno, hemos tenido el reto de, cuando evaluamos evidencia para excluir o no algún tipo de medicamento o tecnología en salud de la financiación por recursos públicos asignados a salud, la evidencia que encontramos es de certeza muy baja y probablemente hay estudios. El concepto que podemos dar ahí es, no hay certeza en la evidencia, ¿sí? Pero el tomador de decisión lo va a requerir. Entonces, mantener la revisión viva nos va a permitir, pues, dentro de un tiempo que no sea muy prolongado, eso habría que pues, definirlo pues, con los entes gubernamentales, da la respuesta cuando se completen los datos del ensayo. Los otros dos procesos que son claves, el contexto colombiano es el de presupuestos máximos, moléculas o tecnologías en salud que van a ser financiadas, requieren demostrar valor. Y por artículo 72 de la Ley Estatutaria en Salud, pues toda molécula nueva que vaya a recibir pues la aprobación por INVIMA también tiene que ser enviada a IEDS para que se le haga un estudio de valor terapéutico. ¿Qué sucede en estos dos casos? Que muy probablemente hay pocos estudios, o los pocos estudios son los estudios pivotales y hay estudios en curso. Entonces, en el momento en que se haga la evaluación, tenemos una certeza en evidencia, pero parcial. Y más aún cuando tenemos que evaluar seguridad, que pues, se requiere estudios a más largo plazo. Son dos contextos que son supremamente claves para hacer la revisión sistemática viva. Es el reto que tenemos. Entonces sí consideramos que nos va a ser de bastante ayuda en estos procesos clave.
Voy a saltarme a Daniel para ir donde John, porque de pronto nos da una idea más global, Daniel, de lo que creemos y luego hablamos de la experiencia de nosotros. ¿Te parece? John, now we are talking about living reviews. You know, of course, with COVID, we have had a lot of examples around the world published in websites and also in journals. Could you let us know a little bit about the evidence that COVID has had in living reviews, what you have done, also challenges that you have had?
Well, you know, I didn't know too much about them going into COVID, but they've kind of, in a way, revolutionized the world that we now live in. And my view is it's just now going to be the new normal. Policymakers are now going to expect this to be the standard on the big topics of the day. They now know these things exist and they feel strongly they should exist going forward because, as I said before, Canada may need to know it on Wednesday and Colombia a week from Friday, and we need to have that continuously updated piece of work. They're like what I've been struck by in watching people do them. Remember, we do living evidence profiles, again, where the unit is existing syntheses, but we're involved in ones like the ones that you two lead on vaccine effectiveness. And the thing that strikes me is there's a front end loading to get them going. But then after that, there's really two things that are critical: incredibly good project management skills, and you just build it into your schedule. You know, if you're updating it every 2 weeks, you have work being done in chunks during those 2 weeks, and then you deliver the report. And I'm not convinced it actually takes more than this craziness that we used to do, which is you'd work on a review for a year, and you know, you'd write a protocol and then you put it aside and then you start to work on it and then you come back and then you need to update your search and then you come back. Like there's so much wasted time often in a systematic review. And if you start off by saying this is a high priority topic, we're going to project manage this really well. We're going to do a lot of thinking at the beginning, and then we're going to focus on, with whatever periodicity, adding the additional studies and getting the update out. So project management strikes me as being the single most important skill, but the other is stakeholder engagement, because as you know, every second Friday, poor Ivan has to sit on a call with me where I'm trying to negotiate with government people who always want to just keep adding and adding and adding and making it more frequent and more complex. And I have to be that interface between the two and say, look, we can add all of this for Omicron, but then we can't keep doing it for Delta and the old variant. So what's the trade-off between the two? And if your living evidence synthesis is going to have an impact, you need to adjust to how decision makers are thinking about the issue and what types of evidence are useful, and then adjusting your work as you go. So that stakeholder engagement piece to me is absolutely critical. Otherwise, you could have living evidence synthesis that takes a lot of time, but it's not adding value to decision making in an ongoing way. So those to me are the big challenges. Really big need for project management and really big need for stakeholder engagement to negotiate over scope and the evolving changes.
And at the global level, you see that many decision makers that have known that living evidence synthesis could be done, they won't be able to come back to regular reviews, not even to rapid reviews.
Yeah.
In general, you have seen that at a global level, there is an environment for funding, continue funding this kind of initiatives?
Well, that's the challenge we're at right now, which is why part of the Evidence Commission Secretariat's role is every week we probably spend 5 hours in meetings with people that have an influence on the global evidence architecture to say, you need to rethink this stuff and you need to figure out how are you going to fund an ongoing stock of living evidence syntheses around the globe, and how are you going to coordinate that, and you know, if we need, you know, whatever 4 on vaccine effectiveness, who's going to fund that on an ongoing basis, and which teams are going to do it? And maybe a little bit of redundancy is fine. Like for COVID drug treatments, we have 3 of the great groups in the world doing that set of living evidence syntheses, and that's great. But some of them are doing it off the corners of their desk, and we need to figure out stable funding flows and a variety of other support so that they can do that kind of stuff. But it feels to me like we've moved into a world where the new normal is global evidence-related public goods, which are going to be these living syntheses, and then these context-specific syntheses. This is what it means for Colombia on this issue at this time. And the old world of rapid reviews and more traditional one-off systematic reviews that may or may not get ever updated. I'm not sure we're going to be seeing as much of those in future.
And well, finally, what would be finally for you, because you need to go before the rest of the panelists, what would be the role of Cochrane in this world living evidence, considering Cochrane with all the bureaucracy and all the process that usually takes?
I think Cochrane should be at the epicenter of the evidence architecture for living evidence syntheses in the health space. You know, I don't know how many topics will end up becoming prioritized for living evidence syntheses, but let's say it's 150. Who knows, might be 500. Like, we don't yet know how many we would all agree need to, because the decision-making need is ongoing and the evidence is changing sufficiently rapidly to justify. But Cochrane is the single best place global network to do it. And its model that it's moving to of designating something like 8 units around the world, my hope would be those 8 units are focused in significant part on maintaining that global stock of living evidence syntheses. If they do it right, those 8 units should be partnered with groups like Danielle's that can also do the contextualized evidence support for their country and their region. So I think Cochrane, if it plays its card right, should be right at the center of that new health-related evidence architecture. But it really needs to get out there. You know, the strategy change, the loss of funding has diverted attention, and now it needs to execute this exciting new plan for these units around the world that will work in a much more coordinated way and pump out really high value global public goods.
So perhaps to summarize and to wrap up your idea, it's like a model in which we could kind of prioritize main questions at a global level are of common interest, and big groups like Cochrane and others, like Johanna Briggs Institute and others, could work on that. And maybe some countries, some institutions, more at a local level, working another question that would be of their interest, and they could fund maintaining living review, like for instance, that could be done on an HTA agency or some related organization. That would be a model that you can see could work perfectly. And additionally to that, also working in the usual rapid review to respond very quick questions for specific contextually driven problems. Is that what you're saying?
That's it. Yeah.
Perfect.
And I'll just say one other thing on the funding side. You know, this is a job for the UN. Like the UN should be in the game of supporting global public goods. These types of living evidence syntheses are a quintessential example of the global public good. The World Bank, it's at times refers to itself as the Knowledge Bank. It should be the main funder of this global suite of living evidence syntheses for the full range of topics, not just health. But if the bank won't step up, then a variety of UN system entities, WHO and others need to do it. And WHO has finally now negotiated a better financing arrangement, but what it's being asked to do is to move into this new space of supporting a global evidence architecture with this suite of living reviews. And that is a big ask of them to play that role, and that will take a lot of money, but somebody needs to fund it. And then we need the best in class shops around the globe, like yours and others, to be part of those units that are producing these products.
It also needs to be articulated with the guidelines world, because there are also some folks around the world working on living guidelines.
Absolutely.
And these works are not, these people are not necessarily working with the living reviews. So I think that there's also a lack of articulation there.
Absolutely. So, and you know, I think we'll also eventually go to living technology assessments of some type as well, but you're absolutely right that you know, evidence synthesis world and guidelines world have to come together with a coordinated approach to living products. They have to start working together. And that's going to have to be the new order of business going forward. They can no longer work separately because it's just too important to maintain this stock of living evidence products on the big issues of the day, both the syntheses and the guidelines.
Perfect. Well, maybe if there is one español, perdón. Si hay alguna pregunta que alguien en el auditorio quiera hacerle a John, que tiene que irse dentro de pocos minutos. Si no hay alguna pregunta que quieran hacerle, seguimos discutiendo con el resto de los panelistas. Tenemos esta oportunidad. No veo manos alzadas. Perfecto. Seguimos, simplemente que uno de nuestros panelistas tiene que o tú le vas a hacer algo. Dale, dale.
No, John, I wanted to clarify, maybe to have some clarification around this. So these living evidence synthesis, they summarize global evidence, right? And the purpose is to keep going with this intention of summarizing global evidence. So what is the role of the team like Ivan of me? I see two roles. One is helping on the methods part of producing this living evidence, but the second one is about contextualizing that evidence. And my question would be, what are your ideas of, for examples of how we can contextualize that evidence within the country?
So, you know, to me, it would be an issue of the contextualization ideally isn't going to be supply side driven, it'll be demand side driven. So you'll have relationships with policymakers who will say, Danielle, we have 3 days before we need to brief the minister to make a decision. We need the best evidence on X. You will then turn to this stock of living evidence syntheses, and then you'll ideally in future, they'll also be oriented to equity considerations, context considerations. So you might look at one and say, okay, all the evidence in the world, and they've helped me think about equity, and they've talked about how the findings vary by groups and context. So I'm going to take the parts of the evidence applicable to Colombia, and I'm going to write a rapid synthesis specific to the Colombia context. Here is the best evidence in the world as it applies here, and you'll use, you know, local language, local frameworks connected to the exact local decision. So then you don't have to be the one going out and finding all of the evidence. You're saying it sits out there, but I'm going to package it in response to a question in ways that will resonate immediately to Colombian decision makers. If they want to look at the living evidence synthesis themselves and use their own policy, political, and systems analysis skills to contextualize it, great. but it's probably you who are going to do it to a much, much higher standard.
Thank you, John. You're free to go. Thank you very much for your time and for your questions. Daniel, no sé si quieres comentar un poquito sobre el tema de las revisiones vivas y cómo lo percibimos nosotros desde la UNED.
Sí, nosotros pues hemos sido muy afortunados en poder trabajar con John y con el equipo de COVID y de poder aprender sobre este tema de las síntesis rápidas de evidencia. Es uno de esos ejemplos de colaboración entre diferentes equipos. El papel que juega la unidad en esa síntesis viva de evidencia nosotros hacemos, Juan Camilo la presentó ayer en la mañana, hacemos una síntesis viva de evidencia sobre la efectividad y la seguridad, sobre efectividad de vacunas en niños para COVID-19. Es una síntesis de evidencia que se actualiza cada 2 semanas y que se sube al repositorio cada 2 semanas al repositorio de COVID. Es un trabajo colaborativo porque el tomador de decisiones que requiere esta información está en Canadá, se hace para la Agencia de Salud Pública de Canadá. Principalmente ellos son los que están muy interesados en esa información. Entonces John es el que tiene el contacto con el tomador de decisiones. Ahorita cuando él estaba explicando esa negociación que le toca hacer con el tomador de decisiones para decir, bueno, no vamos a seguir incluyendo más de cierta variante, nos vamos a enfocar en la otra. Es una negociación que él hace directamente con el tomador de decisiones. Entonces el tomador de decisión lo hace en el MAC. También en Canadá hacen la búsqueda de la información y de los nuevos artículos que están saliendo sobre la efectividad de vacunas para niños, y a nosotros nos llega la lista de estudios de diferentes fuentes que Canadá encuentra usan inteligencia artificial para buscar los estudios, les llegan las listas de OMS, bueno, nos llegan como 4 listas de diferentes fuentes con los estudios que están llegando sobre la efectividad de vacunas para niños. ¿Qué más ayuda a McMaster? Ayuda en esto que él llamaba la gestión del proyecto, ¿cierto? Ellos tienen digamos, un formato muy estructurado en el cual se debe presentar la información, entonces eso ahorra mucho tiempo en donde se tiene que cargar la información, las tablas en las que se tiene que cargar. Ahí en el repositorio ustedes pueden encontrar vacunas para adultos y vacunas para niños, y si miran las 2 síntesis tienen muchas similitudes en la manera en que se presenta la información. Entonces nos llegan las búsquedas y lo que hacemos aquí en el equipo de la unidad es, digamos, toda la parte metodológica de la síntesis. Tenemos 2 personas, Juan Camilo y Pamela, que se encargan de hacer el Inclusion Assessment de títulos y resúmenes, de full text, aplicar el riesgo de sesgos a los estudios que incluimos, y hacemos la redacción de los hallazgos principales. Eso se pone en el formato que tenemos preestablecido con McMaster, se sube cada miércoles, y sale la publicación después de la discusión del viernes, Iván, ¿cierto? Cada viernes sale publicada la última versión en la página. Es un equipo que, bueno, con el equipo de McMaster que hace las búsquedas, y en la unidad lo coordina Iván, y trabajan pues fuertemente en el Juan Camilo y Pamela.
No es cada miércoles, cada 2 miércoles.
¿Cada qué?
2 miércoles.
Sí, se actualiza cada 15 días.
Sí. La revisión de adultos, que fue la que empezó Alfonso Llorio, el equipo con John, es la que empezó en el 2020, y esta sí empezó cada semana durante 8 meses. Cada semana, y era un trabajo masivo de cada semana actualizar la cantidad de información, e incluimos preprints siempre en la evaluación. Y la de niños, por tener menos evidencia, se hace cada 15 días. Ahora la de adultos pasó a cada 15 días, y pues seguimos trabajando y tenemos reportes la próxima semana. Eso como con el resumen. No sé si alguien del auditorio está interesado en plantear alguna pregunta de ambos temas, tanto revisiones rápidas, revisiones vivas, el futuro de la revisión, de la síntesis de evidencia para informar decisiones a cualquier nivel, y la experiencia que se ha tenido tanto desde el IETS como desde la Universidad de Antioquia, o alguien, algún otro grupo quiere plantear algo sobre su experiencia, también estaremos interesados, tenemos algunos minutos. Sí.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación. Es un tema que me parece muy interesante y que me parece que a raíz de COVID también ha dado un boom muy interesante a nivel mundial y que por lo menos en el área de la salud ha evolucionado, me parece considerablemente. La duda mía va precisamente si en otras áreas de educación, de seguridad humana, ambiental, han conocido, tienen experiencia de avances en este tema de la síntesis rápida, porque si bien en el área de la salud ha evolucionado y ha tenido un boom con el tema del COVID, pues yo tengo la oportunidad también de estar trabajando con equipos multidisciplinarios donde además de profesionales de la salud hay educadores, sociólogos que están muy interesados también en el tema de síntesis de evidencia. Quisiera saber si dentro de las experiencias o los trabajos colaborativos que han tenido, tiene más o menos una idea de cómo es ese panorama de las síntesis rápidas en otras áreas distintas a la de la salud.
Yo creo que Daniel puede dar unos, o bueno, los dos, esa es la pregunta para los dos.
No, y este está enfocado en área de salud, sí. Básicamente, pues, contratante de este tipo de revisiones, el Ministerio de Salud y Protección Social en la Dirección de Costos, Tarifas y Regulación, la de medicamentos, etcétera. Hemos hecho algunos trabajos para el Ministerio de Hacienda también, pero más por el lado, por ejemplo, de evaluaciones económicas, incluso algunos análisis de impacto. Entonces, creería que la pregunta estaría más dirigida a Daniel.
Yo creo que cada vez se ve más la necesidad de aplicar estos mecanismos para informar a los tomadores de decisiones con la mejor evidencia disponible en otros sectores. Y hay organizaciones que lo hacen, la colaboración Campbell, ¿cierto? La que es homóloga a la colaboración Cochrane. Este grupo tenemos también en la unidad, estamos participando con un grupo que se llama 3IE, que hace evaluación de impacto, pero hace también síntesis de evidencia de otros sectores, educativo, agricultura. En la unidad específicamente tenemos un proyecto que nos financia para hacer este tipo de trabajos, de informar decisiones de política con diferentes mecanismos, síntesis rápidas o resúmenes de evidencia para política o mapas de evidencia en sectores que no sean salud, y pudimos hacer uno en la participación de niños, niñas y adolescentes en las políticas públicas en la ciudad de Medellín en el 2019. Entonces hemos estado incursionando en otros sectores y creo que la pandemia también mira que el Ministerio de Educación nos pidió varias síntesis rápidas de evidencia en el tema de educación, del tema de colegios, lo que tenían que hacer los colegios, el tema de la alimentación escolar, el tema de los dormitorios escolares. Bueno, entonces había una necesidad del sector educativo también por tomar decisiones con la mejor evidencia. Vemos que eso cada vez es más frecuente, ¿no? O sea, cada vez nos llegan, hicimos también un mapa de evidencia, no una síntesis rápida, un mapa de evidencia en el tema de habitante de calle, intervenciones intervenciones para el problema de habitantes de calle. Entonces la unidad está, la parte metodológica es la misma, la parte de buscar la evidencia, hacer inclusion y exclusion assessment, de hacer extracción de información, evaluación de la calidad, cambia el tema. Entonces estamos moviéndonos en la dirección de síntesis rápidas específicas. Hicimos unas para el Ministerio de Educación.
Eso por supuesto trae otros retos. El tema de diversificar los expertos. El tema de tener expertos en otras áreas que inclusive Fabio lo había mencionado previamente. Tener sociólogos, educadores como parte del equipo. Y ese otro reto, los diseños y la evidencia proveniente de estas otras áreas, por supuesto que tiene otro foco. No vamos necesariamente a encontrar los famosos ensayos clínicos. Tenemos que adaptarnos a otro tipo de evidencia cualitativa, contextual, evidencia, resúmenes de políticas y otro tipo de cosas que no son las habituales que utilizamos en las revisiones sistemáticas. Pero hay interés, y el avance que ha tenido la síntesis de evidencia en salud ha sido bien visto por esas otras áreas y quieren incorporarlos, y que va a haber necesidad de crear más capacidad al respecto. Fabio, adelante.
Sí, no, quería complementar algo que podría en parte responder la pregunta del doc. Creo que ustedes también lo han hecho, y eso por el lado de metodología, ¿sí? Nosotros también tenemos la experiencia haciendo una revisión rápida sobre metodologías para priorizar. La enfocamos en su comienzo en problemas pues, de salud para el país, a la luz después del modelo de atención integral en salud territorial, MAITE, Pero creemos que ese ejercicio, por ejemplo, que es pues, priorizar un problema, pues apuntaría a otras áreas, ¿no? O sea, podrían tener criterios similares, etcétera, y eso nos lo dio una revisión rápida porque era el requerimiento en ese momento.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias. Adelante.
Hola. Ahora sí. Sí. Bueno, de nuevo gracias y gracias por la discusión. Creo que definitivamente lo que hemos venido escuchando, creo que es la batería. Lo que hemos escuchado durante estos días, pues nos permite tener una visión un poco más amplia y muy contextualizada de lo que se puede. Es decir, cómo hablar con los clínicos para que puedan, por ejemplo, en los diferentes ámbitos, entender los resultados de este tipo de revisiones rápidas, de revisiones vivas, cuando todavía tenemos dificultades para entenderme la medicina basada en la evidencia como tal, y cuando tenemos incluso retos que esta pandemia nos ha demostrado que nos podemos equivocar frecuentemente, y la cantidad de retractos, por ejemplo, que ha habido en las diferentes revistas, incluso revistas muy prestigiosas, es importante. Y cómo también permitir que los receptores finales de las intervenciones que van a hacer pues, la comunidad y los pacientes pues puedan entender lo que les estamos trasladando acerca de esto, que es una condición cambiante. Entonces, es simplemente un comentario de que nos debemos empezar a unir más como academia, como instituciones públicas oficiales, para ir haciendo una educación mayor a todos los niveles, para ir entendiendo mejor cada uno de estos procesos, pero quería también escuchar cómo lo podemos ir planteando, desde su experiencia, cómo se puede ir planteando esta educación en todos los contextos. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Juan Carlos. Digamos que basado en la experiencia, cuando hicimos algunos ejercicios de exclusiones, o los que estamos haciendo, pues también con el grupo UNED, que pues Daniel nos ayudó, ya le apostábamos en el resultado final a hacer un informe completo, un informe para el profesional de salud, para la ciudadanía, y un informe para la ciudadanía. ¿Qué nos ayudaba en ese escenario? Un integrante que es clave en los equipos actualmente, está cogiendo bastante fuerza, y es el cualitativo. ¿Sí? Muy probablemente la experiencia de la investigación cualitativa nos ayuda a hacer esa transferencia de conocimiento, y es la que nos ha ayudado, y la queremos pues seguir trabajando y explorando. Por supuesto, desde el área de trabajo del epidemiólogo clínico está el reto de escoger, por ejemplo, cuál tabla de evidencia de las que propone GRADE usar para el tomador de decisiones, pero también está el reto de saber transmitir el mensaje con el comentario adecuado. Entonces, creemos que ver estas posibilidades que ofrece, por ejemplo, el grupo GRADE, con esas tablas de resumen de hallazgos, y ver la integración y el aporte que hace el investigador cualitativo, nos ayuda a hacer una buena transferencia del conocimiento, que es algo que pues, estamos trabajando y en lo cual estamos tomando experiencia hasta ahora.
Discutimos con varios ciudadanos esa evidencia científica que sacamos. Lo que sale de ese panel de ciudadanos más la síntesis de evidencia es lo que le llevamos a veces a los tomadores de decisiones en un diálogo de política. Entonces, esos ejercicios como de contextualización de la evidencia nos ayudan a pues como aclarar ese mensaje, de tenerlo en los términos adecuados para que le llegue a los públicos adecuados. Pero yo creo que siempre hay que pensar, por lo menos en el propósito de la unidad, que es distinto a lo que es el propósito de Cochrane, ¿cierto? El propósito de nuestra unidad es informar las decisiones de diferentes actores, ¿cierto? Entonces, pacientes. ¿Cómo informamos las decisiones de pacientes? Tenemos poca experiencia, pero uno de nuestros propósitos es desarrollar ayudas para toma de decisiones de pacientes, ¿cierto? Donde puedan ir los pacientes que tienen preguntas concretas para mirar cuál es la mejor evidencia, y eso lo tenemos que mostrar de la mejor manera para los pacientes. Las infografías han ayudado mucho en eso, en fin. Para profesionales tenemos lo del tema de las guías de práctica clínica. La pregunta tuya es compleja porque aunque tengamos las guías de práctica clínica, que son un producto dirigido a los profesionales de la salud, recomendándoles y diciéndoles para el paciente A, le recomendamos hacer A, B, C y D, es cambiar la práctica y que eso se implemente, es otro mundo, ¿cierto? Para tomadores de decisiones tenemos los resúmenes de evidencia para política, que no están organizados en introducción, métodos, resultados, discusión, sino en cuál es el problema político a abordar, cuáles son las opciones para abordar ese problema y cuáles son las barreras de implementación que tienen que hacer. Y eso hace parte de tratar de ajustar el formato al receptor final. Eso.
Hay una cosa adicional que hay que tener en cuenta que ha ayudado también y es involucrar al usuario en diferentes momentos durante el proceso de la revisión. No solamente que lo reciba al final, ya completo, sino del momento de la pregunta, muy probablemente cuando ya están los resultados de efectividad y seguridad, y luego cuando ya tenemos el resultado del ejercicio de para qué se utilizó esa evidencia, ¿sí? Por ejemplo, tomar una decisión, etcétera. Involucrarlos previamente ayuda a que la transmisión del resultado final sea más clave, más clara.
Sí, complementando ahí, eso lo tenía por aquí apuntado. ¿Quién hace la pregunta? El uso de estos productos de síntesis de evidencia rápidas o síntesis de evidencia o living reviews es muy importante que partan de un tomador de decisión que requiere esa información. El ejemplo que David, nuestro compañero, expuso ayer del cannabis medicinal es una pregunta específica al Ministerio de Salud que nos dijo: necesitamos saber dónde poner el límite de fiscalización para los medicamentos de cannabis. Y hicimos la búsqueda de la evidencia para esa pregunta en específica, nos reunimos con ellos para aclarar muy bien la pregunta, hacer la búsqueda de la evidencia y involucrarlos en diferentes momentos del proceso, varias reuniones mostrándoles los resultados, y eso hace que el usuario final realmente, pues, que sea útil ese producto. Eso no pasa pues, con otros grupos, pero con los tomadores de decisiones de política, sobre todo, lo importante es que la pregunta parta de ellos.
Perfecto. Un espacio para una última pregunta que tenemos atrás.
Sonido.
Ok, bueno, muy buenos días desde Perú, de la Red de Eficacia Clínica. Tengo una pregunta justamente en esa, digamos, un poco en la última parte de la discusión. Entendemos que las revisiones sistemáticas rápidas, ¿no? Las clásicas o los living, finalmente lo que aportan son inconclusiones, ¿no? O sea, la información que puede más o menos brindar sobre algún aspecto de la evidencia, ¿no? Sobre una pico en específico. Sin embargo, esas conclusiones no son todavía decisiones, ¿no? ¿Cómo hacen, digamos, cómo va en Colombia de repente la experiencia para trasladar esa conclusión y que se transforme en una decisión, entendiendo que en la decisión hay muchos más aspectos a considerar, ¿no? O sea, ya de repente los tomadores de decisión o los grupos de pacientes, los grupos de profesionales de la salud, ya se involucran más desde algún marco metodológico, por ejemplo, el marco GRADE, el marco ETD, perdón. Esa es una pregunta, o sea, desde el punto de vista metodológico, ¿cómo va ese avance? Y segundo, ya desde el punto de vista de una vez que ya se tiene, ya no la conclusión, sino la decisión misma, ¿cómo se asegura que esa decisión sea aplicada? Comentaban un poco lo de las guías. Estas guías ya en su país de repente tienen algunos marcos normativos de aplicación estricta o de control allí del uso o no uso de las intervenciones, que sería un paso siguiente, ¿no? Un poco la implementación de estos instrumentos que se van elaborando desde el gran enfoque de medicina basada en evidencia para construir eso que se llama un ecosistema basado en evidencia, ¿no? No sé si hay algún comentario al respecto.
A ver si entendí bien la situación, pero la pregunta está relacionada de esas conclusiones que sacamos en la síntesis de evidencia, cómo se vuelven recomendaciones y digamos, unos mensajes que lleven más a la acción. En el tema del caso de los profesionales en la salud, como tú mencionaste específicamente el ETD, ¿cierto? El Evidence to Decision Frameworks, ahí se han desarrollado mucha metodología para poder llegar a esas recomendaciones. Esta es lo que dice la evidencia científica y ahora metámosle otros criterios de los valores y preferencias de los pacientes, cosas de costo-efectividad, en fin, otra serie de criterios y saquemos una recomendación que diga lo que creemos que hay que hacer es A, B, C y D. Eso en el tema de profesionales. La posición que nosotros hemos adquirido para el caso de tomadores de decisiones de política, ¿cierto? Por ejemplo, el tema de el límite de fiscalización para los medicamentos de cannabis o otras decisiones de política, no de profesionales, no usamos el ETD, lo que nosotros usamos es hacer una síntesis de evidencia de las opciones de política que ellos están considerando, ¿cierto? Recogemos la evidencia científica y la recomendación o la decisión de lo que debe hacer el tomador de decisiones no está en nuestras manos. Nosotros creemos que en ese campo de la política es muy importante que la evidencia científica se discute y se contextualice en discusiones, le llamamos diálogos deliberativos o diálogos de política con las diferentes partes interesadas, donde ahí pueden salir un montón de cosas que la evidencia científica no alcanzó a recoger sobre, hablamos en esos diálogos de políticas, hablamos del problema, de las opciones y de las barreras de implementación. Salen muchas barreras de implementación que en la literatura no las logramos identificar. Cuando miramos las barreras y los facilitadores en la literatura, nos damos cuenta que una barrera es la falta de entrenamiento de los médicos para prescribir medicamentos de cannabis. Y de pronto en el diálogo de política nos dicen, no, eso no es una barrera, porque los médicos en el currículo de Colombia ya tienen incluido eso no es una barrera en Colombia. Entonces, es esa contextualización de la evidencia científica la que a nosotros pues al tomador de decisión le permitirá, con la evidencia científica, más lo de la discusión de los valores y preferencias de los pacientes que hacemos en los paneles de ciudadanos, más el diálogo de política con las diferentes partes interesadas, con la industria en este caso, con el Fondo Nacional de Estupefacientes, tomar una decisión más informada, pero nosotros no recomendamos cuál es la decisión, que sí pasa un poco en otros contextos como en el de las guías de práctica clínica, donde hacen la síntesis de la evidencia y después con el Evidence to Decision Framework pasan a hacer las recomendaciones. Nosotros en el campo de la política no hacemos esa transición de esa manera. Esa es nuestra aproximación.
En el caso de IETS, hay productos que, digamos que por reglamentación o por resolución, piden partir de una pregunta de política, como es el caso de la exclusión. No hay efectividad y seguridad, recomienda no financiarlo y toca llegar a ese tipo de respuesta porque pues, lo exige la ley. En ese caso, y en la mayoría de los productos, casi siempre se va a hacer un panel. El panel puede ser en diferentes momentos y ese panel recoge el reporte final y agrega algunos otros elementos como son la perspectiva, por ejemplo, del experto clínico o el especialista clínico. Eso por un lado, entonces el producto va a llegar al tomador de decisiones con dos puntos de vista, así el resultado de la evidencia contextualizada y también lo que añada el especialista clínico en cuanto a sus valores y preferencias. Y por otro lado, los productos están trabajándose con un proceso de formación de los pacientes, ¿sí? No solamente invitarlos a participar y vote por el desenlace, sino cuál es su misión aquí, cuál es su función, y eso nos ayuda pues, a llevar valores y preferencias de ellos un poco más firmes y más sólidos para el tomador de decisión. Ahora, lo que pasa en Colombia, por ejemplo, con algunos productos como este de exclusiones es, una vez ellos reciben el informe de la evidencia que produjo la revisión sistemática rápida, hacen otra serie de productos o de trabajos o de etapas. Entonces hay un proceso en el cual informan a la ciudadanía, trabajan con la ciudadanía de manera independiente y ahí tienen otro tipo de información para luego llegar a un resultado de panel final donde han recogido toda la evidencia de participación ciudadana, la que proyectó el instituto e incluso las sociedades científicas son invitadas y ellos hacen revisiones incluso independientes. Pero pues es común con lo que dice Daniel, o sea, nosotros producimos la evidencia, o más que producirla, pues la sintetizamos, miramos qué certeza hay en ella, y sobre esta base, el tomador de decisiones, que en el caso nuestro, pues es el ministerio y sus dependencias, es el que da la decisión final, o toma la decisión final, de incluir, no excluir algún medicamento, etc.
Perfecto, pues muchas gracias a los panelistas, a Daniel y a Fabio por su colaboración, por responder las preguntas y por compartir las experiencias. Y nos quedamos unos minutos que vamos a hacer un pequeño resumen del proceso de los trabajos de investigación, a escoger los mejores trabajos puntuados y además hacer la clausura de una vez porque es una clausura muy corta. porque hay gente que de aquí se va, otros se quedarán en los talleres, pero otras personas no volverán. No nos vamos a demorar mucho. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, entonces vamos a presentar cómo fue el proceso de la elección de los trabajos finalistas y los ganadores. Nosotros recibimos 97 trabajos en total de diversos temas, de diferentes sitios hasta internacionalmente, y a lo cual agradecemos inmensamente porque pues se nota el interés por participar, por compartir los trabajos que se han hecho, y de verdad que felicitamos ese esfuerzo. Después de recibir los 97 trabajos, hicimos el ciego, se retiró la autoría y de alguna manera que se pueda reconocer de dónde eran, y se repartió por nuestros evaluadores que venían a quien agradecemos inmensamente. Teníamos un formato para evaluación, puntaje, y venían de la Universidad del Cauca, de Antioquia, de Cartagena, de Imbanaco, de Cardioinfantil, Nacional, Fuchs y de la Javeriana. Además de la evaluación virtual, hicimos presencial. De los últimos, de los finalistas, se evaluó y se hizo retroalimentación acá de los que quedaron como los primeros puestos para la representación física. Todos estos pósters están todos están colgados en la página, en el link de la virtual, para que los puedan seguir revisando, visitando y contactando si necesitan alguna información. Diversos temas, multidisciplinario, maravilloso, metodológico, clínico. Esto de verdad que nos da una gratificación inmensa. Entonces, gracias por participar. Entonces, voy a leer los premios. El tercer puesto. ¿Ya? Entonces, el tercer puesto es para el estudio denominado Política informada por la evidencia sobre el uso de cannabis medicinal, fiscalización, efectividad, seguridad y apoyo para pacientes, profesionales y comunidad, por los doctores Daniel Patiño, Pamela Velázquez, David García, Ángela Pérez, Isabel Marín, Claudia Vera, Viviana Vélez, Claudia Vélez, Paola Ramírez e Iván Flores. Doctor, ¿quién es? Y el primer puesto es por el trabajo de exactitud diagnóstica para el diagnóstico de deficiencia de glucosa 6-fosfato deshidrogenasa, una revisión sistemática de la literatura, por los doctores Juan Camilo Martínez, Lina Gaviria, Viviana Vélez, Daniel Patiño, Mari López e Iván Flores. Muy bien. Bueno, nos queda agradecer a todos por la asistencia. Tuvimos presencialmente hasta 160 personas aquí en el auditorio, y virtualmente hubo un momento que había 400 personas. Claro, entran y salen y entran, y son hasta 400 personas en la visita, pues en el link virtual. La organización impecable, nos han consentido terriblemente. Todo el proceso pues que hemos tenido en estos meses ha sido súper fluido. Uno que otro susto, pero realmente todo salió divino. Muchísimas gracias a todos por la participación, la organización, la asistencia. Queremos invitarlos a que sigan participando, a seguir trabajando en equipo. Vemos cómo de tantas disciplinas tan diferentes podemos trabajar y producir productos buenos para nuestros pacientes, para el país, para el mundo. Pues entonces, invitación a que hagamos grupos y a seguir participando y a seguir en la colaboración. Gracias por las preguntas, bastante participación del público, gracias por la asistencia a los talleres. Entonces, pues nos queda la invitación a que sigan participando, que sigan las redes. Tenemos redes en Twitter, en Facebook, en todas las formas. Bueno, ya, creo que eso es todo. Muchas gracias, en serio, por haber estado acá.
Muchísimas gracias por haber aceptado esta invitación. Para quienes tienen la duda frente al certificado de participación, Finalizando la próxima semana o iniciando la semana siguiente, les estaremos enviando un enlace de descarga con el instructivo para que ustedes entren a nuestra plataforma de extensión y puedan descargar entonces el certificado académico. Recuerden que nuestros eventos del centro de extensión, como ahora tenemos, somos los primeros oferentes a nivel nacional, ustedes suman créditos educativos en la plataforma de ASCOFAM, este evento da créditos educativos. Invitamos a los coordinadores de Cochrane para que pasen, se tomen la foto antes del almuerzo y regresaríamos nuevamente para los talleres, igualmente como ayer asignados en el auditorio 1 y 2 a la 1:30 de la tarde. A esa hora entonces iniciaríamos nuevamente los talleres. Invito entonces a nuestros coordinadores para que pasen por favor, se tomen la foto y muchísimas gracias también por haber asistido. Nos vemos.